What if everything you knew about your family turned out to be a lie? Tonight, we uncover the haunting tragedy of the Parkers, a family whose picture-perfect life unravels after a mysterious disappearance leaves them reeling. What secrets lie buried in the shadows of their once idyllic home? Stay tuned as we dive into a tale of betrayal, heartbreak, and devastating truths that will leave you questioning everything. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment below where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your story. Rain drizzled steadily on the sprawling town of Willow Creek, its soft patter muffling the chaos that had engulfed the Parker household. The once lively home, with its grand oak doors and ivy-covered walls, now stood as a monument to unease. Inside, the air was thick with tension. Emily Parker, the youngest member of the family, had disappeared 3 days prior, and every hour since had chipped away at the family's fragile facade. Brian Parker sat by the window, his hand clutching a photograph of Emily, his eyes hollowed by sleepless nights. His wife, Laura, paced the room, her every movement tinged with an anger that barely masked her despair. The family had been questioned by the police repeatedly, each interrogation unraveling pieces of their lives they had desperately tried to keep hidden. But it wasn't just Emily's disappearance that haunted them. It was the questions. Questions that hinted at a darkness no one dared to acknowledge. "Brian," Laura said sharply, her voice cutting through the oppressive silence. "What aren't you telling me?" Brian turned to her, his face pale. "I've told you everything. I don't know what happened. She was playing in the yard, and when I looked again, she was gone." "Playing in the yard?" Laura snapped. "Do you even hear yourself? You were supposed to watch her. And now She choked on the words, unable to finish the sentence. As the argument escalated, Sarah, Brian's sister, appeared in the doorway. Sarah, ever the mediator, had taken it upon herself to keep the family grounded during the crisis. But even her calm demeanor was beginning to crack. "Stop it, both of you," Sarah said firmly. "This isn't helping. We need to focus on finding Emily." Laura glared at Sarah. "And what about you, Sarah? You seem awfully composed for someone whose niece is missing. What are you hiding?" Sarah flinched at the accusation, but her composure quickly returned. "Don't turn this into something it's not. I'm doing everything I can to help." But Laura wasn't convinced. The police investigation had revealed inconsistencies in the family's statements, fueling suspicions and igniting whispers among the townspeople. Why had Brian left the yard when Emily disappeared? Why had Sarah's alibi been vague, with no corroborating witnesses? And why was Laura so adamant about keeping the media away from their home? That night, as the rain continued to fall, Brian stood alone in the backyard, staring at the swing where Emily had last been seen. He replayed the moment in his mind over and over, trying to grasp what he could have missed. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. It was Sarah. "I need to tell you something," she said hesitantly, her voice barely audible over the rain. Brian turned to her, his heart pounding. "What is it?" Sarah hesitated, her eyes darting around as if afraid someone might overhear. Finally, she spoke. "There's something you don't know about Laura," Sarah said. "Something I've kept quiet for too long." Brian's breath caught in his throat. "What are you talking about?" Before Sarah could answer, a loud knock echoed from the front door, startling them both. The police had returned, their faces grim. One officer held a piece of fabric, a torn scrap from Emily's dress, found deep in the woods behind the house. The revelation sent a shockwave through the room. Laura sank to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. Brian's hands trembled as he took the fabric from the officer, the weight of its implications crushing him. But it was Sarah's reaction that stood out. She didn't cry. She didn't gasp. She stood perfectly still, her expression unreadable. "Where exactly did you find this?" she asked, her voice steady. The officer hesitated. "Near the old cabin, about a mile from here." Brian's head snapped up. "The cabin? That place has been abandoned for years." "Maybe not as abandoned as you think," the officer replied. The words hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy with implication. Brian turned to Sarah, his voice shaking. "What do you know about the cabin, Sarah?" But Sarah didn't answer. Instead, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving Brian and Laura staring after her, their questions multiplying by the second. Later that night, unable to sleep, Brian ventured into Sarah's room, searching for anything that might explain her strange behavior. In the back of her closet, hidden beneath a pile of old clothes, he found a box. Inside were photographs, dozens of them of Emily. But these weren't ordinary family photos. In each one, Emily was standing in front of the cabin. Brian's hands shook as he flipped through the pictures, each one raising more questions than the last. Why had Sarah kept these photos hidden? And why hadn't she mentioned the cabin when the police brought it up? As he stared at the final photo, a detail caught his eye. In the background, barely visible, was a figure. It was blurry and indistinct, but unmistakably there. A chill ran down Brian's spine as he realized the figure was staring directly at the camera. The clock struck midnight, and Brian knew he wouldn't find any answers until he confronted Sarah. But when he went to her room, she was gone. All that remained was a single note on her bed. "I'm sorry." The following morning, Willow Creek was cloaked in an eerie stillness, as though the town itself sensed the tension bubbling within the Parker family. Brian sat at the kitchen table, Sarah's note clutched in his hand. He hadn't slept, the events of the night replaying in his mind like a broken record. Laura, pale and red-eyed, stood by the window, staring blankly at the rain-soaked street. "What do you mean, Sarah's gone?" she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. "She left this," Brian said, sliding the note across the table. Laura picked it up, her hands trembling. "I'm sorry?" That's all she has to say. Her voice rose with each word, cracking under the weight of her anger and fear. "She knows something, Brian. She's hiding something, and now she's just gone." "She mentioned something about you last night," Brian said hesitantly. "Before the police came." Laura froze. "What are you talking about?" "She said there was something I didn't know about you. Something she's been keeping quiet." Laura's face darkened, her expression a mix of hurt and fury. "Are you seriously accusing me of something? Our daughter is missing, Brian." "I'm not accusing you," Brian said defensively. I don't know what to think anymore." Before Laura could respond, a knock at the door interrupted them. It was the police again, this time with a question that sent shivers down Brian's spine. "Do either of you recognize this?" The officer held up a weathered diary, its leather cover cracked with age. Brian and Laura exchanged confused glances before shaking their heads. "It was found near the cabin," the officer explained, along with more scraps of Emily's dress. Brian's heart sank. "What does it say?" "We're still deciphering most of it," the officer replied. "But there's one entry that stands out." He opened the diary to a bookmarked page and began reading aloud. "They'll never know the truth. The cabin will keep our secrets, just as it always has." The room fell silent, the weight of the words pressing down on everyone. "Whose diary is it?" Laura asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're not sure," the officer admitted. "But there's a name written on the inside cover." He hesitated, as though reluctant to say it. Finally, he flipped the diary around and showed them the inscription. "Sarah Parker." Laura gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "That's not possible. Why would Sarah have a diary like this?" Brian stared at the diary, his mind racing. "She's been hiding things. The photos, the cabin. What else hasn't she told us?" The officer nodded. "We're conducting a search of the cabin and the surrounding woods. If there's anything else out there, we'll find it." As the police left, Laura sank into a chair, her composure unraveling. "This doesn't make any sense. Sarah wouldn't hurt Emily. She loves her." Brian didn't respond. He wanted to believe that too, but the evidence was piling up, and his sister's actions were becoming harder to defend. Hours later, unable to sit idly by, Brian decided to search the cabin himself. Against Laura's protests, he drove through the winding forest roads, his headlights cutting through the thick fog that had settled over the area. The cabin loomed ahead, its weathered exterior barely visible through the dense trees. Brian hesitated before stepping out of the car, the air heavy with an unnatural stillness. Inside, The cabin was cold and dark, the only sound the creak of the wooden floorboards beneath his feet. Dust motes danced in the weak sunlight streaming through the broken windows. The space felt untouched, yet suffused with an eerie sense of familiarity. As Brian searched, his flashlight illuminated strange markings on the walls, symbols etched into the wood. He recognized them from the photos he'd found in Sarah's room. "What is this place?" he muttered to himself. In the corner of the cabin, partially hidden under a rotting blanket, he found a small wooden box. Opening it, he discovered a stack of letters, each addressed to Sarah but signed with a name he didn't recognize. Abigail. One letter, dated years earlier, stood out. "Sarah, we've done what we can to protect the family, but the truth will come out eventually. The cabin is no longer safe. If they find out what happened here, everything will fall apart." Brian's hands shook as he read the words, his mind reeling. Protect the family? What truth? He needed answers, and there was only one person who could provide them. He turned to leave, but as he stepped outside, he froze. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, partially obscured by the trees. It was too far away to identify, but something about the silhouette sent a jolt of fear through him. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it turned and disappeared into the forest, leaving Brian standing in the clearing, the letters clutched tightly in his hand. When he returned home, Laura was waiting for him, her expression a mixture of relief and anger. "What were you thinking? Going out there alone?" Brian ignored her question, tossing the letters onto the table. "We need to talk about Sarah," he said. Laura picked up the letters, her eyes scanning the words. Her face paled as she read the one signed by Abigail. "Abigail was my grandmother's name," she whispered. Brian's jaw tightened. "Your grandmother? What does she have to do with this?" Laura shook her head, her voice breaking. "I don't know. She died before I was born. My mother never talked about her." Before Brian could respond, the phone rang, cutting through the tension. Laura answered it, her expression shifting from confusion to dread as she listened. When she hung up, her hands were shaking. "That was the police," she said, her voice barely audible. "They found something else at the cabin." "What?" Brian asked, his stomach nodding. Laura hesitated, her eyes brimming with tears. "A locket. Emily's locket." Brian's world tilted. The locket had been a gift for Emily's birthday, a cherished possession she never took off. Its presence at the cabin raised questions neither of them were ready to face. As the weight of the discovery settled over them, a thought gnawed at the edge of Brian's mind. Sarah's note, the diary, the photos, the letters, they all pointed to one inescapable truth. The Parkers had been keeping secrets for generations, and Emily's disappearance was only the beginning. The Parker household was shrouded in a suffocating quiet the following morning, the weight of the previous day's revelations pressing down like an invisible storm. Brian paced the living room, the letters from the cabin spread out on the coffee table. Laura sat nearby, clutching Emily's torn locket, her expression distant and unreadable. "We're missing something," Brian said, breaking the silence. "Something big. Abigail, the cabin, the symbols, they're all connected." Sarah knew. "She's known all along." Laura didn't respond. She hadn't said much since the call from the police, her mind caught in an endless loop of what-ifs and maybes. "What if this is my fault?" she finally whispered. Brian stopped pacing. "What are you talking about?" Laura's grip on the locket tightened. "I didn't tell you everything about my family when we got married. There were things I didn't think mattered. Stories my mother used to tell about Abigail, about how she was different. People in town said she was cursed, that she brought misfortune wherever she went. I thought they were just rumors. Superstition. Superstition doesn't explain why Emily's locket was at that cabin," Brian said sharply. Laura's eyes flashed with anger. "And neither does blaming me for things that happened before I was born." The tension between them was palpable, but before the argument could escalate further, there was a knock at the door. Brian opened it to find Detective Harper, the lead investigator on Emily's case, standing on the porch. "We've uncovered something at the cabin," Harper said without preamble. Laura appeared behind Brian, her face pale. What is it? Harper hesitated, as though unsure how to phrase his next words. There's a hidden cellar beneath the cabin. We found more symbols carved into the walls down there, along with other items. Brian's stomach churned. What kind of items? A collection of photographs, Harper said, his voice grim. Mostly of children. Some date back over 50 years. Laura let out a strangled gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. Brian felt as though the floor had dropped out from under him. What does this have to do with Emily? Harper's expression darkened. One of the photographs shows Emily. It looks recent. Maybe taken just days before she disappeared. The room spun. Brian gripped the doorframe for support, his thoughts a whirlwind of panic and confusion. That's impossible, Laura said, shaking her head. She's never been to that cabin before. Someone took her there, Harper said, his tone grave. And whoever it was, they've been planning this for a long time. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Where's Sarah in all of this? Brian asked, his voice trembling. Have you found her? Harper shook his head. Not yet, but if she's connected to the cabin and everything we found there, we need to question her immediately. As Harper left, Brian turned to Laura, desperation etched into his features. We need to go back to that cabin. Laura hesitated. What good will that do? The police are already searching it. They missed something, Brian insisted. I can feel it. Reluctantly, Laura agreed. Together, they drove to the cabin, the winding forest roads cloaked in an oppressive silence. When they arrived, the property was eerily deserted. Yellow police tape cordoned off the entrance, but the cabin itself loomed dark and foreboding, as though waiting for them. Inside, the air was damp and heavy, the faint smell of decay lingering. Brian led the way, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. They descended into the cellar, their footsteps echoing in the confined space. The walls were covered in the same strange symbols Brian had seen in the cabin above, but here they were more intricate, more deliberate. At the far end of the room, a small table held a cluster of objects. A rusted key, a withered bouquet of flowers, and an old music box. Laura approached the table cautiously, her eyes drawn to the music box. She hesitated before opening it, the haunting melody that played sending chills down her spine. Inside, nestled among the gears, was a folded piece of paper. Brian snatched it up, his hands shaking as he unfolded it. The note was short, written in a scrawling, almost frantic hand. They're watching. The truth is buried, but not forgotten. Find the second locket. Second locket? Laura whispered. Brian's mind raced. Emily's locket had been found near the cabin, but this note implied there was another. What does this mean? Laura asked, her voice trembling. Before Brian could respond, a noise upstairs made them both freeze. It was faint, like the creak of a floorboard, but unmistakable. Someone's here, Brian whispered. He motioned for Laura to stay behind as he crept back up the stairs, his flashlight casting long, shifting shadows. When he reached the main room, he saw a figure standing near the window, their back turned. Who are you? Brian demanded. The figure turned slowly, and Brian's breath caught. It was Sarah. Her clothes were disheveled, her face pale and gaunt. She looked like a ghost of herself, her eyes hollowed by exhaustion. Sarah, Brian said, his voice a mixture of relief and anger. Where have you been? What's going on? Sarah didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stepped forward, holding something in her hand. It was another locket identical to Emily's. You need to leave, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. What are you talking about? Brian demanded. What's this about a second locket? What do you know about Emily? Sarah's eyes filled with tears. I've been trying to protect you, she said, but it's too late now. They're coming. Who's coming? Laura asked, emerging from the cellar. Before Sarah could answer, the sound of footsteps echoed outside the cabin, followed by the unmistakable click of a car door. Panic flickered across Sarah's face. You have to hide, she urged. Now? Brian and Laura exchanged a glance, fear and confusion swirling in their minds. But before they could move, the door burst open, and the nightmare they thought they'd escaped came rushing back to claim them. The cabin door slammed open, and a chilling gust of wind swept inside, extinguishing the weak beam of Brian's flashlight. In the sudden darkness, the only sound was Laura's sharp intake of breath. Brian's heart pounded as he instinctively reached for her hand, pulling her closer. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice cracking. From the doorway, a figure emerged, cloaked in shadow. The beam of a flashlight flickered to life, illuminating a face Brian didn't recognize. A man with sharp features and cold, calculating eyes. Behind him, two other figures stepped inside, their expressions grim and unreadable. "Sarah," the man said, his voice smooth but menacing. "I see you've broken the rules again." Sarah shrank back, clutching the second locket tightly in her hand. "Please," she whispered. "They don't know anything. Let them go." The man's gaze shifted to Brian and Laura. "I doubt that," he said. "But we'll find out soon enough." Brian stepped forward, shielding Laura. "Who are you? What do you want?" The man ignored him, turning back to Sarah. "You were supposed to keep them out of this. And now look where we are." "They're my family," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "I couldn't let them." "Your family," the man interrupted, a note of disdain in his voice. "How noble. But nobility doesn't erase the debt, does it?" "Debt?" Brian repeated, his confusion deepening. "What debt? What is he talking about, Sarah?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't want you to find out this way." "Find out what?" Laura demanded. The man's smirk widened as he stepped closer, his presence suffocating. "The truth," he said, "about who your dear Sarah really is." "Stop it," Sarah pleaded, her voice breaking. The man ignored her. "Did she tell you about Abigail? About the family curse? Or how she's been keeping secrets from you for years?" Brian felt the ground shift beneath him. "What is he talking about?" he asked Sarah, his voice rising. Sarah's hands trembled as she clutched the locket tighter. "Abigail wasn't just our grandmother. She started something, a pact, a promise to protect the family at any cost. The cabin was part of it. But things got out of control." Laura's face paled. "Out of control? What do you mean?" Sarah hesitated, her gaze darting between Brian, Laura, and the man in the doorway. Finally, she took a deep breath and spoke. "Abigail made a deal," she said. "A deal to protect the family's future. But it came with a price. The locket, the symbols, the rituals, they're all connected to that deal. And now, we're paying for it." Brian stared at her, his mind reeling. "You're not making any sense. What kind of deal? And what does this have to do with Emily?" Sarah's voice cracked as she said the words that would haunt Brian and Laura forever. "Emily was chosen." Laura let out a strangled cry, her knees buckling. Brian caught her before she fell, his own body shaking. "Chosen for what?" he demanded. The man laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Chosen to fulfill the pact, of course. To complete what Abigail started." "That's not going to happen," Brian said through gritted teeth. The man's smirk returned. "You think you have a choice in this? You don't. The wheels are already in motion." Before Brian could respond, Sarah stepped forward, her expression resolute. "Take me," she said. "Leave them out of it." The room fell silent. The man tilted his head, studying her. "An interesting offer," he said finally. "But it's not up to me. The pact doesn't work that way." "What does that even mean?" Laura cried. "What pact? What are you talking about?" The man's gaze turned cold. "You'll find out soon enough." Without another word, he motioned to the two figures behind him. They stepped forward, grabbing Sarah by the arms. She didn't resist, her eyes fixed on Brian and Laura. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Wait!" Brian shouted, lunging forward. But the man raised a hand, and Brian froze, an unseen force holding him back. "You'll stay here," the man said. "For now." With that, he and the others dragged Sarah out of the cabin, the door slamming shut behind them. The silence that followed was deafening. Laura collapsed onto the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. Brian stood frozen, his mind racing. He had so many questions, but the answers felt farther away than ever. After what felt like an eternity, he knelt beside Laura, pulling her into his arms. "We'll get her back," he said, his voice firm despite the tremor in his hands. "How?" Laura whispered. "We don't even know what's happening." Brian glanced at the table, his eyes landing on the second locket. He picked it up, studying it closely. There was an inscription on the back, barely visible in the dim light. "The truth lies within." "What does it mean?" Laura asked, her voice trembling. Brian shook his head. "I don't know, but we're going to find out." As he held the locket, a strange warmth spread through his hand, as though the small object was alive. He didn't know what it meant, but he had a feeling it was the key to everything. Brian's resolve hardened. He didn't know who the man was or what Sarah had gotten them into, but he was determined to uncover the truth, no matter what it took. The Parker home felt like a tomb, its silence punctuated only by Laura's muffled sobs and the occasional creak of the floorboards. Brian sat at the kitchen table, the second locket resting in front of him. Its inscription, "The truth lies within," echoed in his mind, a riddle that refused to resolve. "What does it mean?" Laura asked, her voice hoarse from crying. "I don't know," Brian replied, "but Sarah sacrificed herself to protect us. That means there's something bigger happening, something we're not seeing." Laura rubbed her temples, her exhaustion palpable. "You think this pact, this curse Abigail started, it's real?" Brian hesitated. "I don't know what to think anymore. But whatever it is, it's tied to Emily, the cabin, and now Sarah. We have to figure it out." Before Laura could respond, the shrill ring of the landline broke the silence. They both jumped, the sound jarring in the oppressive stillness. Brian answered the phone. "Hello." There was a pause, followed by a voice he didn't recognize. "You don't have much time," the voice said, low and urgent. "They've taken her to the place where it all began." "Who is this?" Brian demanded, his grip tightening on the phone. "The cabin was just the surface," the voice continued, ignoring his question. "The answers you're looking for are beneath it. But be careful. Not everything is as it seems." The line went dead. Brian stared at the receiver, his heart pounding. "Who was it?" Laura asked, her eyes wide. "I don't know," Brian said. "But they said the answers are beneath the cabin." Laura's face paled. "You're not seriously thinking about going back there, are you?" Brian stood, his jaw set. "I don't have a choice." That evening, Brian drove alone to the cabin, the weight of Laura's protests heavy on his shoulders. The forest seemed darker than before, the trees pressing in on him like silent sentinels. When he arrived, the cabin was exactly as they had left it, silent, foreboding, and steeped in unease. Armed with a crowbar and a flashlight, Brian descended into the cellar. The air was damp and heavy, carrying the faint scent of earth and decay. He scanned the room, his flashlight's beam sweeping over the strange symbols carved into the walls. They said it was beneath the cabin, Brian muttered to himself. He began tapping the floor with the crowbar, listening for any hollow sounds. After several tense minutes, his efforts were rewarded. A faint echo emanated from a section of the floorboards near the far wall. Brian pried the boards loose, revealing a narrow, dirt-encrusted tunnel leading downward. The sight sent a shiver down his spine, but he steeled himself and climbed inside. The tunnel was cramped and dark, the walls damp and crumbling. As Brian moved deeper, his flashlight illuminated markings etched into the dirt. More symbols, growing increasingly intricate and unsettling. Finally, the tunnel opened into a small chamber. At its center was a stone pedestal, and atop it sat a weathered journal, its leather cover cracked with age. Brian approached the pedestal cautiously, his pulse hammering in his ears. He opened the journal, its brittle pages crackling under his fingers. The entries were written in an archaic, almost frantic script, but one passage stood out. "The locket is the key. When combined, they will reveal the path to salvation or destruction. Choose wisely." Brian frowned. Combined? He only had one locket. Suddenly, The ground beneath him trembled. Dust rained from the ceiling as the chamber seemed to shudder, and a low, rumbling sound echoed through the tunnel. Brian grabbed the journal and turned to leave, but as he reached the tunnel's entrance, he froze. Standing at the other end, blocking his exit, was a figure cloaked in shadow. "Going somewhere?" the figure asked, their voice cold and familiar. Brian's heart sank. It was the man from the cabin. Back at the Parker home, Laura paced anxiously, her mind racing. Hours had passed since Brian had left, and the uneasy silence of the house was beginning to feel oppressive. As she passed by Emily's room, something caught her eye, a faint glimmer of light coming from beneath the bed. She hesitated before kneeling to investigate, her hands trembling. Under the bed, she found a small wooden box. Inside was a third locket, identical to the ones Brian and Sarah had found. Laura's breath caught. How had this locket ended up in Emily's room? And why hadn't she noticed it before? She examined the locket closely, her heart pounding as she discovered another inscription. "For the ones who remain." Laura's mind raced. What did it mean? Was it a warning? A clue? Before she could think further, the phone rang again, its piercing tone cutting through her thoughts. She answered it, her voice shaking. "Hello. You found it," the same voice from before said. "Good. Now listen carefully. There's still time to save them, but you must act quickly. Bring the locket to the cabin. Tonight." "What is this?" Laura demanded. "Who are you?" The line went dead. At the cabin, Brian stood frozen, the man's presence filling the small chamber with an oppressive weight. "You shouldn't have come here," the man said, stepping closer. "You're meddling in things you don't understand." "What is this place?" Brian demanded, his voice shaking. "What do these symbols mean? What's in the locket?" The man smirked. "You think you want answers, but some truths are better left buried." Brian's grip on the journal tightened. "I don't care what you think. I'm not leaving without my daughter." The man's expression darkened. "Then you've already made your choice." Before Brian could react, the man raised his hand, and the chamber was plunged into darkness. Brian's flashlight flickered and died, leaving him alone in the suffocating blackness. He fumbled for the crowbar, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Suddenly, a faint light appeared at the far end of the chamber. It was weak and flickering, but it illuminated something that made Brian's blood run cold. A figure standing motionless, their features obscured by the shadows. "Brian," a voice called, trembling with fear. It was Laura. Brian's voice caught in his throat as he stared at the figure in the dim light. His mind raced. Could it really be Laura? Or was this another trick, another manipulation by the man in the shadows? "Laura?" Brian called, his voice trembling. The figure stepped closer, and as the light grew stronger, he saw her face. Pale, tear-streaked, and filled with fear. She clutched a third locket in her hand, its chain dangling like a noose. "Brian," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I found it. In Emily's room. There's another locket." Brian's eyes widened as he processed her words. "A third locket? What does it say?" Laura handed it to him, her hands shaking. He turned it over, reading the inscription aloud. "For the ones who remain." "It's a warning," Laura said, her voice barely audible. "Whoever these people are, they've been planning this for generations." Before Brian could respond, the man from the cabin stepped into the light, his smirk as cold as ever. "Well, isn't this touching?" he said, his tone laced with mockery. "The Parker family, piecing together the puzzle. Too bad you've already lost." "Lost?" Brian snapped, his fear giving way to anger. "You don't get to decide that. Where's Emily? What have you done with her?" The man chuckled, his laughter echoing ominously in the chamber. "You think this is about Emily? This was never about her. She's just a piece of the puzzle. A means to an end." Brian lunged at him, the crowbar raised, but the man sidestepped effortlessly, his movements unnervingly calm. "Violence won't get you what you want," the man said. "But if you're so eager for answers, I'll give you one. Emily is safe for now. But her safety depends on you making the right choice. What choice? Laura demanded, stepping forward despite her trembling legs. The man's eyes gleamed. The 3 lockets are the key. Together, they will reveal the truth. But they will also demand a sacrifice. A sacrifice? Brian echoed, his voice filled with disbelief. What kind of sacrifice? The man tilted his head, his expression almost pitying. Every choice has a cost. The question is, are you willing to pay it? Before either of them could respond, the ground beneath their feet rumbled violently. The chamber shook, sending dust and debris cascading from the ceiling. The man turned, his smirk fading as he muttered, "It's starting." "What's starting?" Brian shouted, but the man didn't answer. He disappeared into the shadows, leaving Brian and Laura alone as the tremors grew stronger. "Brian, we have to get out of here," Laura cried, grabbing his arm. "No," Brian said, his voice firm. "Not without Emily." The tremors subsided as they climbed out of the tunnel and back into the cabin's cellar. The air was thick with tension, every creak and groan of the old wood setting their nerves on edge. Brian placed the 3 lockets on the table, their inscriptions gleaming faintly in the dim light. He flipped through the journal he had found earlier, searching for anything that might explain what to do next. "There's something about combining them," he muttered, his eyes scanning the frantic handwriting. "But it's not clear how." Laura hovered nearby, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. What if this is a trap? What if putting them together makes things worse? Brian hesitated. He didn't have an answer, but every instinct told him that the lockets were the key to finding Emily. Finally, he made a decision. "We don't have a choice. If there's even a chance this can help us find her, we have to try." He placed the lockets together, aligning them carefully. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a faint hum filled the room, growing louder and more intense. The lockets began to glow, their chains twisting together as if pulled by an invisible force. Brian and Laura stepped back, their eyes wide with shock. The light from the lockets grew blinding, and when it finally dimmed, a single object remained on the table. A small, intricately carved key. Brian picked it up, the weight of it heavy in his hand. "It's a key," he said, his voice filled with wonder. "But to what?" Before Laura could respond, the door to the cellar slammed shut, trapping them inside. The room seemed to grow colder, the shadows on the walls twisting and shifting. A low, guttural voice echoed through the air, though its source was impossible to pinpoint. "Only the truth can set you free," it intoned. Brian's grip tightened on the key. "What truth? What do you want from us?" The voice didn't answer, but a series of faint symbols began to glow on the cellar walls, forming a pattern. Laura gasped as she recognized the markings. They matched the ones on the lockets. "It's a map," she said, her voice trembling. Brian studied the symbols, his mind racing. They formed a path leading away from the cabin, deeper into the forest. "This is where we need to go," he said, his determination growing. "But what if it's a trap?" Laura asked, fear evident in her voice. Brian met her gaze, his expression resolute. "We don't have a choice. Emily is out there, and this key is the only thing that can lead us to her." With no other options, they left the cabin, following the map etched in their minds. The forest was dark and foreboding, the trees towering above them like silent sentinels. As they walked, the air grew heavier, the stillness broken only by the crunch of leaves beneath their feet. Finally, they arrived at a clearing. At its center was an ancient stone archway, partially overgrown with moss and vines. "This is it," Brian said, holding up the key. Laura hesitated. "What if this opens something we're not ready for?" Brian looked at her, his expression a mix of fear and determination. "We have to try." He stepped forward and inserted the key into a small indentation on the archway. The ground trembled as the key turned, and a faint glow emanated from the stone. As the archway opened, revealing a dark passage leading downward, Brian and Laura exchanged a glance. "This is it," Brian said. "Whatever's down there, it's the truth, and we're going to face it together." The air inside the passage was cold and damp, a stark contrast to the oppressive stillness of the forest above. Brian held his flashlight tightly, its narrow beam cutting through the darkness. Laura walked behind him, her breaths shallow and uneven. The ancient stone walls surrounding them were etched with more of the symbols they had seen in the cabin and on the lockets, their intricate patterns pulsating faintly as if alive. "What do you think is down here?" Laura asked, her voice trembling. Brian didn't answer immediately. His mind was a swirl of fear and determination. "Emily," he said finally. "We're going to find her." The passage sloped downward, the air growing colder with every step. As they moved deeper, a faint sound reached their ears, a soft, melodic hum that seemed to resonate from the walls themselves. "What is that?" Laura whispered. Brian stopped, straining to listen. The sound was almost hypnotic, pulling them forward like an invisible tether. "Keep moving," he said, his voice firm despite the unease gnawing at him. The passage eventually opened into a cavernous chamber, its size and scale breathtaking. The walls were lined with more symbols, their glowing light casting eerie shadows across the space. At the center of the room stood an ornate pedestal, and on it rested a circular, intricately designed artifact. Brian and Laura approached cautiously, their footsteps echoing in the vast chamber. As they drew closer, the humming grew louder, its melody both haunting and beautiful. "What is this place?" Laura asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Brian didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the artifact, its surface gleaming with an otherworldly light. He reached out hesitantly, his fingers brushing against the cool metal. The moment he touched it, the humming stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. Brian and Laura froze, their hearts pounding in the sudden stillness. Then, without warning, the artifact began to shift. Its surface rippled like water, and an image appeared. A scene that made Laura gasp in horror. It was Emily. She was standing in a room they didn't recognize, her expression calm but her eyes filled with sadness. Surrounding her were the shadowy figures of people Brian couldn't identify. "Emily!" Brian shouted, his voice echoing through the chamber. The image flickered, and a voice resonated from the artifact, low and resonant. "To find her, you must face the truth." Brian stepped back, his mind racing. "What truth? What are you talking about?" The artifact didn't respond. Instead, the image of Emily faded, replaced by another scene, this one even more disturbing. It was Abigail, standing in the very cavern where Brian and Laura now stood. She was younger, but her presence was unmistakable. She was surrounded by a group of people, their faces obscured, as she held up an object that looked eerily similar to the 3 lockets. The voice returned, its tone cold and unyielding. "The pact began here. It will end here. But only one of you may leave." Brian and Laura stared at each other, the weight of the words sinking in. "What does it mean?" Laura asked, her voice breaking. "Why can't we both leave?" Brian shook his head. "I don't know. But whatever this is, it's connected to Abigail, to everything she started." As he spoke, the walls of the chamber began to pulse, their light growing brighter and more erratic. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and the air grew heavy with an oppressive energy. "We have to do something," Laura said, her voice rising in panic. "We can't just stand here." Brian turned back to the artifact, his mind racing. It said the lockets were the key. Maybe they can undo this. He reached into his pocket, pulling out the combined lockets and placing them on the pedestal next to the artifact. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the room was flooded with light, and another image appeared. This time, it was Sarah. She was sitting alone in a dark room, her face streaked with tears. She looked directly at the camera, as though she could see Brian and Laura. "I'm sorry," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I was trying to protect you, but I made it worse. They forced me to choose, and I chose wrong." Her image flickered, and her voice grew fainter. "They're not going to let Emily go. Not without a price. You have to." The image cut out abruptly, leaving the chamber in silence once more. Brian clenched his fists, his frustration boiling over. "We're running out of time," he said, There has to be a way to stop this. Laura's gaze was fixed on the artifact, her expression a mixture of fear and determination. What if it's lying? She said suddenly. Brian turned to her. What are you talking about? What if this whole thing, the pact, the lockets, the sacrifice, it's all just a way to manipulate us, to keep us trapped in this cycle? Brian hesitated. The thought had crossed his mind, but he hadn't allowed himself to consider it fully. Then what do we do? He asked. Laura took a deep breath, her hands trembling. We break the cycle, whatever it takes. Before Brian could respond, the artifact began to glow again, and a voice filled the chamber, louder and more menacing than before. Choose, or lose everything. The ground shook violently, and the light from the walls began to fade, plunging the chamber into darkness. Brian grabbed Laura's hand, his grip tight. We'll figure this out, he said. Together, but deep down, he knew the choice would come sooner than they were ready for. The chamber descended into an oppressive darkness, pierced only by the faint glow of the artifact. Brian and Laura stood frozen, their breaths shallow, the weight of the voice's ultimatum crushing them. The air around them grew heavier, charged with a tension that made every movement feel like wading through water. Brian turned to Laura, his voice a whisper. We can't let it manipulate us. Whatever this is, we have to think clearly. Laura's eyes glistened with tears, her face illuminated by the pulsing glow. It wants us to choose between ourselves, Brian. How are we supposed to make that choice? How do we decide who stays and who leaves? Before Brian could answer, the artifact shifted again. The glow intensified, casting long, flickering shadows on the chamber walls. A new image appeared. This time, it showed Emily in a room shrouded in darkness, her face streaked with tears. Mommy? Daddy? Her small voice called, cracking with fear. Emily! Laura cried, reaching for the artifact as if she could pull her daughter from its surface. Emily's image flickered, her voice trembling. They said I have to wait, but I'm scared. I want to come home. Brian's heart clenched as he watched his daughter's terrified face. Emily, we're coming for you, he said. His voice firm despite the fear gnawing at his resolve. The image shifted again, and this time, the room they didn't recognize became clearer. The walls were lined with the same symbols they had seen throughout the cabin, the lockets, and the tunnel. Brian narrowed his eyes. That place, it's here somewhere. We just have to find it. Brian, Laura said, her voice trembling. What if we're already too late? He turned to her, his expression resolute. We're not giving up. Not now. Not ever. They turned their attention back to the chamber, scanning for any clues that might lead them to Emily. The walls continued to pulse faintly, the symbols shifting as if alive. The artifact remained at the center, its glow pulsating in rhythm with the symbols around them. Wait, Laura said suddenly, pointing to a section of the wall. Look at that symbol. It's different. Brian followed her gaze. Among the glowing patterns, one symbol stood out. It was larger, more intricate, and seemed to shimmer with a light of its own. Do you think it's a door? Laura asked. Brian approached the wall, running his fingers over the symbol's surface. The stone beneath it was cool to the touch, but as he pressed against it, the air around them shifted. A faint click echoed through the chamber, and a section of the wall began to slide open. Behind it was another passage, its entrance shrouded in darkness. Brian glanced at Laura. This has to be it. She hesitated, her fear evident. What if we're walking into a trap? We don't have a choice, Brian said. Emily's in there. Can feel it. The passage was narrower than the first, its walls pressing in on them like a suffocating embrace. The glow from the chamber faded as they moved deeper, leaving only the faint beam of Brian's flashlight to guide them. The air grew colder, and an unsettling stillness filled the space. Laura clung to Brian's arm, her breathing shallow. Do you hear that? She whispered. Brian paused, straining to listen. At first, there was only silence. But then, faint and distant, came the sound of a child's laughter. Emily, Laura gasped, her grip tightening on Brian's arm. The sound was faint and echoing, as if coming from miles away. They quickened their pace, following the haunting melody through the twisting passage. The laughter grew louder, mingling with a faint, melodic hum. The sound seemed to wrap around them, pulling them forward. Finally, the passage opened into another chamber. This one was smaller than the first, its walls lined with glowing crystals that bathed the room in an ethereal light. At the center of the chamber was Emily. She stood on a raised platform, her small frame bathed in the glow of the crystals. Her eyes were wide with fear, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "Mommy! Daddy!" she cried, her voice echoing through the chamber. Brian and Laura rushed forward, their hearts pounding with relief. But as they approached the platform, a barrier of light appeared, stopping them in their tracks. "What is this?" Brian demanded, slamming his hands against the invisible wall. Emily reached out, her fingers brushing against the barrier. "I don't know," she said, her voice trembling. "They told me I have to stay here." "They?" Laura asked, her voice breaking. "Who told you that, baby?" Before Emily could answer, the air in the chamber shifted. The crystal's glow intensified, and the humming grew louder. A voice filled the room, low and resonant. "You have arrived at the final choice." The voice was the same as before, the one that had spoken from the artifact. "What choice?" Brian demanded, his anger boiling over. "What do you want from us?" The voice ignored him. "The pact demands fulfillment. One must remain so that the others may leave. Choose wisely." Brian and Laura stared at each other, their faces pale. "This is insane," Laura said. "We can't. There has to be another way." "Emily's not staying here," Brian said firmly. "If someone has to stay, it's going to be me." Laura's eyes filled with tears. "Brian, no. We'll find another way. We'll fight this." "There is no other way," the voice intoned. "The pact is unbreakable. The choice must be made." The humming grew louder, the crystal's light pulsating in time with the voice. Emily began to cry, her small fists pounding against the barrier. "Please, don't leave me," she sobbed. Brian turned to Laura, his resolve hardening. "Get her out of here," he said, "no matter what it takes." "No," Laura cried, grabbing his arm. "We're not doing this. Not like this." Before Brian could respond, the voice spoke again. "The time has come. Choose or lose everything." The chamber trembled, the crystals glow blinding. Brian and Laura clung to each other as the room seemed to collapse around them, the weight of the choice pressing down like an unstoppable force. The chamber was alive with light and sound, the air vibrating with an energy that felt almost alive. Brian and Laura stood frozen, their minds racing as the voice's ultimatum echoed in their ears. Choose or lose everything. Emily, trapped on the glowing platform, sobbed uncontrollably. Her small fists pounded against the barrier, her cries cutting through the chaos like a knife. "Please don't leave me. Mommy, Daddy." Brian clenched his fists, his heart breaking at the sight of his daughter's terror. He stepped forward, his voice firm despite the tremor in his hands. "You want someone to stay? Fine, take me. Just let them go." "No," Laura shouted, grabbing his arm. "We're not doing this. There has to be another way." "There is no other way," the voice boomed, its tone cold and unyielding. "The pact must be fulfilled. Only through sacrifice can the balance be restored." Brian turned to Laura, his expression resolute. "I can't let Emily grow up without both of us. If someone has to stay, it's going to be me." Tears streamed down Laura's face. "Don't you dare. Don't you dare do this, Brian." "I don't have a choice," he said, his voice breaking. "She's our daughter. She needs you more than she needs me." "Stop it," Laura screamed. "You can't just decide this." Emily's cries grew louder, her small voice trembling with fear. "Daddy, no. Don't leave me." Brian took a step closer to the platform, his hands trembling. "I love you, Emily," he said, "and I love you, Laura. But this is the only way." But before he could take another step, Laura grabbed his arm with a strength that surprised them both. "You're not going anywhere," she said fiercely. "If anyone's staying, it's me." Brian's eyes widened. "What are you talking about? That's insane." "I mean it," Laura said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. You're stronger than I am, Brian. Emily needs you to protect her. She needs you to take her away from this nightmare and never look back. Brian shook his head, his throat tightening. No, I can't let you do this. You don't have a choice, Laura said, echoing his earlier words. The voice interrupted, its tone growing impatient. The choice must be made now. The balance cannot wait. The chamber began to tremble, the light from the crystals growing blindingly bright. Emily's cries became muffled, as though the barrier was pulling her farther away. Brian and Laura stared at each other, their eyes locked in a silent battle of love and desperation. Then, in a move that left Brian reeling, Laura stepped forward, her expression calm and resolute. I choose me, she said firmly. Take me. The voice fell silent. For a moment, the chamber was still, the oppressive energy dissipating as the crystal's glow softened. Then the barrier around Emily disappeared, and she stumbled forward, her cries turning to gasps of relief. Mommy! She cried, running to Laura and throwing her arms around her legs. Brian moved to pull them both into an embrace, but before he could reach them, a new barrier appeared, this time surrounding Laura alone. No! Brian shouted, pounding against the barrier as it solidified. No! This isn't how it's supposed to happen. Laura knelt, holding Emily close. It's okay. Baby, she whispered, her voice trembling. You're going to be okay. Mommy, don't go. Emily sobbed, clutching her mother desperately. I love you, Laura said, her tears falling freely now. Both of you. Always. The light from the crystals intensified, engulfing the room in a blinding glow. Brian shielded his eyes, his heart shattering as Laura's figure began to fade. Laura! He screamed, his voice raw with anguish. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the light vanished, leaving the chamber cold and dark. Laura was gone. Brian sat on the floor of the chamber, clutching Emily tightly as the weight of what had just happened threatened to crush him. Daddy, Emily whispered, her voice trembling. Where's Mommy? Brian swallowed hard, his throat tight. She saved us, he said, his voice breaking. She saved you. Emily buried her face in his chest, her small body shaking with sobs. Brian held her close, his mind racing. He couldn't let Laura's sacrifice be in vain. Whatever the pact was, whatever Abigail had started, it needed to end. As Brian carried Emily out of the cavern, the passageway behind them began to collapse, the walls crumbling as though the pact's power was unraveling. By the time they reached the forest above, the entrance to the underground chambers was completely sealed. The air outside was crisp and cold, the sky above them filled with stars. For a moment, Brian felt a flicker of hope. They had survived. Emily was safe. But as he held his daughter close, a chilling thought crept into his mind. The voice had said the pact was unbreakable. Laura's sacrifice had freed Emily, but had it truly ended the cycle? The night air was heavy with silence as Brian walked through the forest, Emily cradled in his arms. The weight of her small body was nothing compared to the burden pressing down on his heart. Laura was gone, her sacrifice a wound that refused to stop bleeding. The passage had sealed itself behind them, but the voice's chilling words lingered in Brian's mind. The pact is unbreakable. Emily's quiet sobs eventually gave way to soft breaths as she fell asleep, her small fingers clutching Brian's shirt. He held her tighter, his mind racing. He needed answers about the pact, about Abigail, about what Laura had truly given up. And most of all, he needed to make sure that this nightmare was truly over. When they finally reached the edge of the forest, the Parker house came into view, its dark silhouette standing against the night sky. Brian hesitated before stepping inside, the warmth of the home a stark contrast to the icy chill of his thoughts. He laid Emily on the couch, covering her with a blanket, and then sank into the armchair across from her. The house was suffocatingly quiet, every shadow stretching longer than it should have. Brian's gaze fell on the journal he had taken from the chamber, now resting on the coffee table. Its leather cover was worn, the edges frayed, as though it had been handled countless times over the years. He reached for it, flipping to the last entry he had read. The pact demands fulfillment. Only through sacrifice can the balance be restored. He traced the words with his finger, his mind turning them over. Abigail's pact had saved the family from something, some danger or curse, but at what cost? And if the balance had been restored, why did he feel like the nightmare was far from over? Hours passed, the stillness of the house broken only by the faint creak of the floorboards as Brian paced back and forth. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Brian froze, his heart racing. He wasn't expecting anyone, especially not at this hour. He approached the door cautiously, his hand hovering over the knob before finally pulling it open. Standing on the porch was Detective Harper, his expression grim. "Brian," Harper said, his voice low. "We need to talk." Brian stepped aside, motioning for the detective to enter. Harper glanced around the house, his gaze lingering on Emily, who was still asleep on the couch. "I heard about what happened," Harper said, his tone cautious. "The cabin, Laura, everything." Brian's jaw tightened. "How could you possibly know that?" Harper hesitated, his eyes narrowing. "There's more going on here than you realize. The Parkers have a history in this town. A history that's been kept quiet for generations." Brian's hands clenched into fists. "If you know something, now's the time to tell me." Harper reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a folder. "This is everything I've been able to find about your family's connection to Abigail and the cabin. But it's not pretty." Brian took the folder, his hands shaking as he opened it. Inside were old photographs, newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes. One headline stood out: "Tragedy at Willow Creek. Abigail Parker's pact saves family but sparks controversy." The accompanying article detailed a series of mysterious events surrounding Abigail, including accusations of witchcraft and strange disappearances linked to the cabin. "What is this?" Brian demanded, his voice rising. "Abigail made a deal," Harper said. "One that kept the family safe but cursed them to carry its weight forever. The pact required balance. A life for a life." Brian shook his head, disbelief washing over him. "Laura gave her life. That should have ended it." Harper's expression darkened. "The pact doesn't end. It only resets. And as long as those lockets exist, the cycle will continue." Brian's stomach dropped. "The lockets?" Harper nodded. "They're the anchors. Destroy them, and you might have a chance at breaking the cycle for good." Brian wasted no time. After Harper left, he gathered the 3 lockets, placing them on the kitchen counter. Their chains were still twisted together, their surfaces gleaming faintly in the dim light. Emily stirred on the couch, her small voice breaking the silence. "Daddy?" Brian rushed to her side, pulling her into his arms. "I'm here, sweetheart," he said, his voice trembling. "Where's Mommy?" she asked, her eyes wide with confusion. Brian's throat tightened. "Mommy? She's not here right now, but she loves you so much." Emily nodded slowly, her tiny hand reaching up to touch his face. "Don't go away too." "I won't," Brian promised, though the weight of that promise felt heavier than anything he'd ever carried. Later that night, Brian stood outside in the backyard, a hammer in his hand. The lockets lay on a stone slab in front of him, their intricate designs catching the moonlight. He hesitated, the weight of what he was about to do pressing down on him. Destroying the lockets might break the cycle, but it might also unleash something far worse. Taking a deep breath, he raised the hammer and brought it down with all his strength. The first locket shattered, a burst of light emanating from its fragments. The ground beneath him trembled, and a low, guttural sound echoed through the air. Brian didn't stop. He smashed the second locket, then the third, each strike sending a shockwave through the night. When the final locket broke, the air around him grew still. The tremors stopped, and an eerie silence settled over the yard. Brian's chest heaved as he stared at the shattered pieces. He didn't know if it had worked, if the cycle had truly been broken, but for the first time in days, the oppressive weight in the air seemed to lift. As he turned to go back inside, a faint voice stopped him in his tracks. "Brian, He froze, his blood running cold. The voice was soft, familiar, and unmistakable. "Laura," he whispered, his heart pounding. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the faint echo of her voice. "You broke the lockets," it said. "But the pact is never truly broken." Brian stood frozen in the backyard, the shattered remnants of the lockets gleaming faintly at his feet. The voice, soft, familiar, and unmistakably Laura's, sent a chill racing down his spine. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying her words like an echo from another world. "The pact is never truly broken." "Laura," he called out, his voice trembling. "Where are you? What does that mean?" The air remained still, the only response a faint rustling of leaves. Brian's heart pounded as he scanned the yard, desperate for some sign of her presence. But there was nothing, only the oppressive darkness pressing in around him. Inside the house, Emily's voice called out, breaking the silence. "Daddy?" Brian turned, his fear momentarily replaced by urgency. He rushed back into the house to find Emily sitting up on the couch, her small frame trembling. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" he asked, kneeling beside her. Emily's eyes were wide, her face pale. "I saw her," she whispered. Brian's stomach tightened. "Saw who?" "Mommy," Emily said, her voice shaking. "She was standing by the window. She said she couldn't come in." Brian's breath caught in his throat. He glanced toward the window, but the yard beyond was empty. "She said it's not over," Emily continued, her voice barely audible. Brian pulled her into his arms, his mind racing. Whatever was happening, it was clear that Laura's sacrifice hadn't ended the nightmare. It had only deepened the mystery. Determined to find answers, Brian spent the rest of the night poring over the journal he had taken from the chamber. The pages were filled with cryptic entries, each more unsettling than the last. One passage caught his eye. "The lockets bind the cycle, but breaking them unleashes what was contained. The pact's origins lie deeper than the surface, rooted in the blood of the first." The first, Brian muttered to himself. "Abigail." He flipped through the journal, searching for more mentions of Abigail. The entries grew more erratic, the handwriting scrawled and frantic. Her sacrifice was the beginning, her blood the anchor. To undo the pact, one must return to where it all began. Brian's mind raced. Abigail's bloodline had started the cycle. But what did that mean for him? For Emily? And where had it all begun? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps upstairs. He froze, his pulse quickening. "Emily?" he called out, but there was no response. He grabbed a flashlight and made his way upstairs, each creak of the floorboards amplifying the tension. When he reached Emily's room, he found her standing by the window, staring out into the darkness. "Emily," he said softly, stepping into the room. She turned to him, her expression distant. "They're waiting," she said. Brian's blood ran cold. "Who's waiting?" Emily pointed toward the forest. "By the cabin. That's where Mommy is." By the time dawn broke, Brian had made up his mind. He couldn't ignore the pull of the cabin, the sense that it held the answers he so desperately needed. He packed a bag with a flashlight, the journal, and the shattered remnants of the lockets, then turned to Emily. "You're coming with me," he said, his voice firm. Emily nodded, her small face resolute. The forest was eerily quiet as they made their way back to the cabin, the morning light casting long shadows across the path. Emily clung to Brian's hand, her gaze fixed on the trail ahead. When they reached the cabin, Brian's breath caught. The structure, which had seemed dilapidated and abandoned before, now pulsed with an unnatural energy. The symbols carved into its walls glowed faintly, as though alive. Inside, the air was heavy, charged with the same oppressive tension they had felt in the chamber. Emily led the way, her small footsteps eerily confident. They descended into the cellar, and Brian's heart sank. The tunnel that had collapsed before was now open, its darkness yawning like a mouth ready to swallow them whole. "Emily, stay close," Brian said, gripping her hand tightly. They ventured into the tunnel, the flashlight's beam cutting through the shadows. The path twisted and turned, the walls narrowing until they were forced to walk single file. The air grew colder, the silence pressing in on them. Finally, the tunnel opened into a new chamber, larger than the first, its walls covered in glowing inscriptions. At the center was a pedestal, and atop it rested a blood-stained dagger. Emily gasped, her small hand flying to her mouth. "Daddy, look," she whispered, pointing to the far wall. Brian turned, his flashlight illuminating a mural etched into the stone. It depicted Abigail, surrounded by shadowy figures, her hands raised in supplication. Beneath her feet, a child lay motionless, their blood pooling around her. "This is where it started," Brian said, his voice hollow. The journal's words echoed in his mind. Her sacrifice was the beginning, her blood the anchor. Before he could process what he was seeing, the voice returned, low and menacing. "The cycle cannot end without a final offering." Brian's grip on Emily tightened. "I've had enough of your riddles," he shouted. "What do you want from me?" The chamber trembled, the light from the inscriptions flickering. "The choice has already been made. You must complete what Abigail began, or lose everything." "No!" Brian shouted. "We've lost enough. This ends now." The voice grew louder, its tone filled with fury. "Defiance will not save you. The pact is eternal. The bloodline must pay." Suddenly, the room was filled with blinding light, and Brian was thrown backward, his grip on Emily slipping. When the light faded, Emily was gone. Brian scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding. "Emily!" he screamed, his voice echoing through the chamber. The voice spoke again, cold and final. "The cycle will continue. The bloodline must pay." Brian's knees buckled as he stared at the empty pedestal, his mind a whirlwind of fear and despair. He had thought the lockets were the key, that breaking them would end the nightmare. But now he realized the truth. The pact wasn't about the lockets, it was about them. And it wasn't over. Brian stumbled backward, his knees weak as the reality of Emily's disappearance sank in. The air in the chamber was suffocating, heavy with a presence that seemed to mock his desperation. The glowing inscriptions on the walls flickered erratically, casting unsettling shadows across the room. "Emily!" Brian shouted again, his voice cracking. The only response was the echo of his plea, bouncing off the stone walls like a cruel taunt. His flashlight flickered, its beam sweeping across the blood-stained dagger on the pedestal. His mind churned with questions. How had Emily vanished? Why had the voice demanded her? And what did the cryptic warnings about Abigail and the pact truly mean? The journal was still clutched tightly in his hand, its brittle pages trembling as he flipped through them. He scanned the chaotic scrawl of Abigail's entries, searching for anything that could explain what had just happened. "The bloodline is the key," one entry read. "The pact demands balance, but the cycle cannot end without a final offering. To break the chain, one must return to the beginning." Brian's jaw tightened. "The beginning," he muttered. "What does that even mean?" The voice returned, low and resonant, filling the chamber with its oppressive presence. "The beginning lies not in the cabin, but in the truth you refuse to see." "What truth?" Brian shouted, his frustration boiling over. "Tell me where Emily is." "The bloodline cannot escape its destiny. You cannot undo what has been done. But the choice remains yours. Fulfill the pact or suffer its wrath." Brian's chest heaved with anger and despair. "I've already lost everything. What more do you want from me?" The voice fell silent, leaving Brian alone in the flickering glow of the chamber. Hours passed as Brian searched the chamber and the surrounding tunnels, his flashlight dimming with each passing moment. His calls for Emily went unanswered, and the oppressive silence only deepened his sense of helplessness. Finally, he sank to the floor, his back against the cold stone wall. Exhaustion weighed on him, but his mind refused to stop racing. He replayed the events of the past few days over and over, searching for something he had missed. A clue, a detail, anything that could lead him to Emily. His thoughts were interrupted by a faint sound, barely audible above the pounding of his own heartbeat. It was a soft, melodic hum, like the one he had heard when they first entered the chamber. Brian scrambled to his feet, his eyes scanning the room. The sound seemed to emanate from the dagger on the pedestal, its surface now glowing faintly. He approached cautiously, his flashlight casting long, wavering shadows across the room. As he reached for the dagger, the hum grew louder, resonating in his chest like a heartbeat. The moment his fingers touched the hilt, the room was filled with light. Brian cried out, shielding his eyes as the world around him seemed to dissolve. When the light faded, he was no longer in the chamber. Brian found himself standing in a forest clearing, the air heavy with an eerie stillness. The trees loomed tall and ancient, their twisted branches casting jagged shadows across the ground. In the center of the clearing stood a woman. Her hair was long and silver, her eyes piercing and filled with a sadness that seemed to span centuries. She was dressed in a flowing gown, its fabric shimmering faintly in the dim light. "Abigail," Brian whispered, his voice trembling. The woman turned to him, her gaze steady. "You've come far," she said, her voice soft but firm. "But the journey is not yet over." Brian's fists clenched. "Where's Emily? What have you done with her?" Abigail's expression remained calm. "Emily is where she has always been, at the heart of the pact." Brian shook his head, his anger boiling over. "Enough with the riddles. I need answers." Abigail stepped closer, her presence commanding. "The pact was made to protect the bloodline. But protection comes at a cost. A life for a life. A soul for a soul. Laura gave her life," Brian said, his voice breaking. "Isn't that enough?" Abigail's eyes softened. "Laura's sacrifice saved Emily for now. But the pact is not so easily broken. Its roots run deeper than you know." Brian's breath hitched. "Then tell me how to end it. Tell me how to save my daughter." Abigail hesitated, her gaze flickering with something Brian couldn't quite place. Fear, perhaps, or regret. "To break the pact," she said finally, "you must return to its source. To the moment it was made." "The moment it was made?" Brian repeated. "How?" "That was centuries ago." Abigail's hand reached out, brushing against the dagger still clutched in Brian's hand. "The dagger is the key," she said. "It can take you there. But beware. What you find may not be what you expect." Before Brian could respond, the clearing began to dissolve, the trees and shadows melting away like smoke. Abigail's voice echoed around him, growing fainter with each word. "Return to the beginning and face the truth." Brian awoke on the floor of the chamber, the dagger still glowing faintly in his hand. The symbols on the walls had dimmed, their light now barely visible. He pushed himself to his feet, his mind spinning. Abigail's words echoed in his ears. "Return to the beginning." The journal's final entry flashed through his mind. The pact's origins lie deeper than the surface, rooted in the blood of the first. Brian's grip on the dagger tightened. Abigail had given him a path forward, but it was a path fraught with uncertainty and danger. Taking a deep breath, he turned to the pedestal where the dagger had rested. The faint hum of the cymbals began to rise again, growing louder as Brian held the blade above the pedestal. "If this is the only way to save Emily," he said, his voice steady, "then so be it." He plunged the dagger into the pedestal. The chamber erupted in light, and Brian was pulled into a swirling vortex of sound and color. As the world around him dissolved, one thought filled his mind. "Whatever happens, I will bring her back." The swirling vortex of light and sound engulfed Brian, pulling him through an endless void. Colors flashed in his periphery, blending and distorting until they became nothing but a blur. The hum of the dagger echoed in his ears, growing louder and more insistent, as though it were alive and guiding him. Then, as suddenly as it began, the motion ceased. Brian stumbled forward, landing on uneven ground. He steadied himself, blinking against the harsh light of a pale sun filtering through a dense forest canopy. The air was different, crisp, with a faint metallic tang. The forest around him felt alive, pulsating with an energy that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. Everything was eerily still, the silence pressing against him like a weight. He looked down at the dagger still clutched in his hand. Its blade was clean now, the bloodstains from the chamber gone. It pulsed faintly, as though responding to his presence. "Where am I?" Brian whispered, his voice swallowed by the stillness. As if in answer, the ground beneath him rumbled faintly, and the symbols that had haunted him, etched into the lockets, the chamber walls, and the journal, appeared on the forest floor, glowing faintly. They formed a path, leading deeper into the trees. Brian tightened his grip on the dagger. He didn't know where the path would take him, but he had no choice. Emily was somewhere in this place, and he would do whatever it took to bring her home. The path twisted and turned, leading Brian through a forest that seemed to grow denser and darker with every step. The glow of the symbols on the ground provided his only light, their faint luminescence casting eerie shadows across the twisted trunks and gnarled branches. As he walked, faint whispers began to fill the air. They were soft at first, almost imperceptible, but they grew louder the further he went. The voices were fragmented, overlapping and indistinct, like echoes of a forgotten past. The pact must be fulfilled. A life for a life. The bloodline cannot escape. Brian clenched his teeth, his heart pounding. He tried to block out the whispers, focusing on the path ahead, but the words burrowed into his mind, feeding his fear and uncertainty. Finally, the forest opened into a clearing. At its center stood a cabin, identical to the one he had left behind in Willow Creek, but untouched by time. Its walls were sturdy, its roof intact, and its windows gleamed in the pale light. Brian's breath caught. This was it, the beginning. As he approached the cabin, the whispers grew louder, morphing into voices that seemed to come from inside the building. Brian hesitated at the threshold, his hand hovering over the door handle. He steeled himself, then pushed the door open. The interior of the cabin was warm and inviting, a stark contrast to the oppressive forest outside. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering light across the room. The air smelled of pine and something faintly sweet, like honey. At the center of the room stood a table, and around it sat 3 people. Brian froze. One of them was Abigail. She looked younger than she had in the vision, her silver hair now a rich auburn. Her features were soft, but her eyes were sharp and filled with purpose. The second was a man Brian didn't recognize. His face was gaunt, his expression wary, as though he carried the weight of 1,000 regrets. The third person was Laura. Brian's heart clenched. She looked exactly as she had the last time he saw her. Strong, determined, and heartbreakingly beautiful. "Laura?" Brian's voice trembled as he stepped into the room. She turned to him, her eyes widening with a mixture of relief and confusion. "Brian, what are you doing here?" Before he could answer, Abigail stood, her piercing gaze locking onto him. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice sharp. Brian's grip on the dagger tightened. "I want answers. I want to know what you've done to my family, to Emily." Abigail's expression softened slightly, but her voice remained firm. The pact was meant to protect the bloodline, not to destroy it. But mistakes were made, sacrifices that should never have been demanded. Brian's jaw tightened. What sacrifices? What is the pact really about? Abigail hesitated, her gaze flickering to Laura and then back to Brian. Finally, she spoke. "The pact began long ago, in a time of desperation," she said. "Our family was on the brink of ruin, threatened by forces beyond our control. I made a choice, to bind the bloodline to something greater, something that would ensure our survival." Her eyes darkened. "But I didn't understand the cost. The pact demands balance, and that balance can only be maintained through sacrifice. A life for a life, a soul for a soul." Brian's chest tightened. "And now it wants Emily." Abigail nodded. "The bloodline must pay its debt. That debt cannot be erased, only transferred." "No," Brian said firmly. "I won't let that happen." The man at the table, the one Brian didn't recognize, spoke for the first time. His voice was low and weary. "You can't fight it. The pact is unbreakable." Brian turned to him, his anger boiling over. "Who are you? What do you know about this?" The man met his gaze, his expression filled with regret. "I was the first, the one Abigail sacrificed to seal the pact. My life was taken so the bloodline could thrive." Brian's blood ran cold. You're the anchor, the man nodded. And now the cycle continues. Emily's life is the price for the family's survival. No, Brian said, his voice rising. There has to be another way. Abigail stepped closer, her expression somber. There is no breaking the pact, Brian. But there is a choice. The bloodline must pay. But the soul that pays the price does not have to be hers. Brian's grip on the dagger tightened as the implications of her words sank in. I can take her place, he said, his voice trembling. Laura stepped forward, shaking her head. No, Brian. We already made this choice. I stayed so Emily could live. You can't undo that. I won't lose her, Brian said, his voice breaking. Not while I still have a chance to save her. The room fell silent, the weight of his words pressing down on them. Abigail nodded slowly. Then the choice is yours, she said. But know this. Once the sacrifice is made, there is no turning back. Brian looked at Laura, his heart breaking all over again. I love you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. She reached out, her hand brushing against his cheek. And I love you. Always. Brian turned back to Abigail, his grip on the dagger firm. Tell me what I need to do. The air inside the cabin grew heavy as Abigail motioned toward the table. The dagger in Brian's hand seemed to pulse with anticipation, its faint glow casting eerie shadows on the walls. Laura stood frozen, her expression a mix of defiance and heartbreak. The choice is not simple, Abigail said, her voice steady but tinged with an ancient sadness. It requires strength of will and the ultimate sacrifice. Brian's grip on the dagger tightened. Tell me what to do, he said, his voice firm despite the tremor in his hands. Abigail stepped closer, her piercing eyes locking onto his. The dagger binds the bloodline to the pact. To sever that bond, you must offer a life in place of Emily's. I've already made my choice, Brian said. Take me. No, Laura interrupted, her voice sharp. Brian, you don't understand. If you do this, you'll be gone forever. Emily will grow up without you. And I? She broke off, tears streaming down her face. I don't have a choice, Brian said, his voice breaking. She's my daughter, Laura. I can't let her pay for our family's mistakes. Neither can I, Laura cried. That's why I stayed. That's why I... Enough, Abigail said, her voice cutting through the tension. This is not a decision to be debated. The pact demands action, not words. Brian turned to Abigail, his expression resolute. If I do this, will Emily be safe? Will the cycle end? Abigail hesitated, her gaze flickering with something Brian couldn't quite place. Regret, perhaps, or fear. The cycle will end for her, she said. But the bloodline's fate will always hang in the balance. The pact can never be truly erased, only postponed. Brian's jaw tightened. Then so be it. Abigail guided Brian to the center of the room, where the symbols carved into the floor began to glow faintly. The energy in the cabin shifted, the air crackling with an unseen force. Laura stood on the periphery, her hands trembling as she clutched the edge of the table. Brian, she whispered, her voice trembling. Please, don't do this. He turned to her, his heart breaking at the sight of her tear-streaked face. I have to, he said softly. For Emily. For you. Laura shook her head, her tears falling faster. You don't have to do this alone. We can find another way. There is no other way, Brian said, his voice firm. This ends now. Abigail raised her hands, the glowing symbols intensifying as the room was filled with a low, resonant hum. The dagger in Brian's hand grew warmer, its blade gleaming with an otherworldly light. The pact is bound by blood, Abigail said. To sever the bond, the sacrifice must be willing. Are you ready? Brian nodded, his grip on the dagger steady. I'm ready. Laura let out a choked sob, her knees buckling. Brian, please. I love you, he said, his voice breaking. And I love Emily. Tell her that every day. Before Laura could respond, Abigail spoke the final words of the ritual. The symbols on the floor flared with blinding light, and the cabin was filled with a deafening roar. Brian raised the dagger, his hands steady despite the tears streaming down his face. But just as he was about to plunge it into his chest, a voice shattered the chaos. "Stop!" Brian froze, the dagger hovering inches from his heart. He turned toward the source of the voice, his eyes widening in shock. It was Emily. She stood in the doorway, her small frame illuminated by the flickering light of the symbols. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination. "Emily!" Brian cried, his heart leaping. "What are you doing here?" "I won't let you do this," Emily said, her voice trembling but firm. "I won't let you go." Abigail stepped forward, her expression darkening. "Child, you do not understand the consequences of your actions." "Yes, I do," Emily said, her voice steady. "You said the bloodline has to pay. But it doesn't have to be him." Brian's stomach dropped. "Emily, no. Don't even think about it." Emily's gaze softened as she looked at her father. "You always told me to be brave," she said. "I'm being brave now." "No!" Brian shouted, his voice filled with desperation. "You're not doing this, Emily. I won't let you." Abigail hesitated, her piercing eyes narrowing as she studied Emily. "The pact requires a willing sacrifice," she said. "The choice must be hers." Brian turned to Abigail, his anger boiling over. "You're not touching her. Do you hear me?" But Emily stepped forward, her small hands reaching for the dagger. "Daddy, it's okay," she said softly. "I'm not afraid." "Emily, no!" Brian cried, his voice breaking. Laura rushed forward, pulling Emily into her arms. "You don't have to do this," she said, her voice trembling. "You're just a child. You don't understand." Emily looked up at her mother, her eyes filled with a wisdom far beyond her years. "I do understand," she said, "and I'm not afraid." The room fell silent, the weight of Emily's words pressing down on them like a storm. Abigail's voice broke the silence, low and final. "The pact will take what it is owed. The choice is yours, but time is running out." Brian's grip on the dagger faltered, his mind racing. He couldn't let Emily make the sacrifice. But if he didn't act now, the pact would claim her anyway. The room trembled as the glowing symbols pulsed brighter, their energy filling the air with a suffocating tension. Brian made his decision. "Take me," he said, his voice firm. "Take me instead." "No!" Emily cried, reaching for him. Brian knelt, pulling her into his arms. "I love you, Emily," he said, his voice breaking. "And I love you, Laura. This is the only way." Tears streamed down Emily's face as she clung to him. "Daddy, please don't go." Brian kissed her forehead, his heart shattering. "Be brave," he whispered. He stood, gripping the dagger tightly, and turned to Abigail. "Do it," he said. The room seemed to hold its breath as Brian stepped toward the center of the glowing symbols. Abigail's piercing gaze met his, a flicker of something unspoken. Respect, regret, or perhaps relief, passing across her face. The dagger pulsed faintly in his hand, its warmth a steady reminder of what he was about to do. "Brian, no!" Laura cried, pulling Emily tighter against her. "Please, don't do this." He turned to her, his expression resolute. "I have to," he said, his voice steady despite the tears in his eyes. "This ends with me. Emily deserves a life free from this nightmare." Emily struggled in Laura's arms, her small hands reaching out. "Daddy, please." Brian forced himself to look away, focusing on Abigail. "Tell me what to do." Abigail's voice was calm but heavy with gravity. "The bloodline must pay with a willing sacrifice. Place the dagger at your heart and speak the words that sever the bond." Brian nodded, gripping the dagger tightly. The room seemed to dim, the glowing symbols on the floor intensifying as though drawn to the energy radiating from the blade. "Daddy!" Emily screamed, breaking free from Laura's grasp. She ran toward him, her small hands clutching his shirt. Brian knelt, pulling her close. "Emily," he whispered, his voice breaking, "you're going to grow up strong and brave. You're going to have a beautiful life. And I'll always be with you, even if you can't see me." "No," Emily sobbed, shaking her head. "I don't want a life without you." Laura rushed to them, her tears streaming. She knelt beside Brian, her hand gripping his arm. "Brian, please," she said, her voice trembling. "There has to be another way." "There isn't," Brian said, his jaw tightening. "You said it yourself, Laura. We can't let her pay for this." "Not her." Laura's sobs turned to gasps, her grip tightening on him. "I can't lose you," she whispered. Brian leaned forward, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "You're the strongest person I've ever known," he said. "Take care of her. Take care of each other." Before either of them could respond, he stepped back, his hands trembling as he raised the dagger. As the blade hovered over his chest, the glowing symbols flared, their energy filling the room with a deafening hum. Abigail raised her hands, her voice echoing with ancient authority as she began to chant in a language Brian didn't recognize. The dagger's light intensified, its warmth searing against his skin. Brian closed his eyes, his thoughts filled with images of Emily's smile, of Laura's laugh, of the family they could have been. But just as he was about to plunge the blade into his chest, a voice rang out. "Wait!" Brian's eyes snapped open, his breath catching. Abigail froze, her chant faltering. It was Emily. She stood at the edge of the glowing symbols, her small frame trembling but her expression fierce. "I won't let you do this," she said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "Emily, no," Brian said, shaking his head. "You don't understand." "I do understand," she interrupted, stepping closer. "You said you'd always be with me, no matter what. So if you're going, I'm going too." Brian's heart clenched, his hands trembling. "No," he said firmly. "You can't. I won't let you." Emily's gaze softened. "Then don't leave me," she said. The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging heavy in the air. Abigail's voice broke the stillness, her tone quiet but commanding. "The bond is strongest in the heart of the bloodline," she said, her gaze fixed on Emily. "Her willingness to sacrifice herself has changed the balance." Brian turned to her, his eyes narrowing. "What are you saying?" "The pact was forged in desperation," Abigail continued. "A life offered freely binds the cycle, but a life refused can break it." Brian's breath caught. "Refused? What does that mean?" Abigail stepped closer, her expression unreadable. "Emily's willingness to offer herself is enough to disrupt the pact. If you reject her sacrifice, the bond may be severed. But the decision must be hers, and hers alone." Brian's mind raced, his heart pounding. He looked at Emily, her wide eyes filled with determination. "Emily," he said, his voice trembling, "you don't have to do this. You don't have to give anything. I'll take care of it. I'll make sure you're safe." Emily stepped forward, her small hand reaching for his. "I'm not afraid, Daddy," she said softly. "If it means saving you, I'll do it." Brian's eyes filled with tears as he knelt before her. "No," he said firmly. "I won't let you. Your life is just beginning, Emily. You have so much ahead of you." She hesitated, her gaze flickering between him and Abigail. "But what if it doesn't work?" Brian cupped her face, his voice steady. "You have to trust me. Trust that we'll find another way. Together." The room seemed to hold its breath as Emily nodded slowly, her tears spilling over. "I trust you," she whispered. The glowing symbols began to flicker, their light dimming as the oppressive energy in the room ebbed. Abigail stepped back, her expression unreadable as the dagger in Brian's hand grew cold. "The cycle has been disrupted," she said, her voice quiet, "but its power remains. The bloodline will always carry the weight of the pact." Brian stood, pulling Emily into his arms. Laura joined them, her arms wrapping around them both. Abigail watched them for a moment before speaking again. "You've bought yourselves time, but the pact is eternal. Be wary of its echoes. They may yet find you." With that, she stepped into the shadows, her form fading into the darkness. When the light from the symbols finally disappeared, the Parker family stood in silence, the cabin now still and lifeless. Brian held Emily tightly, his heart heavy but filled with hope. They had survived. They had broken the cycle, at least for now. As they stepped outside into the cool night air, Brian glanced back at the cabin. For a moment, He thought he saw Abigail's silhouette in the window, watching them with a solemn expression. But when he blinked, it was gone. The walk back through the forest felt endless, each step laden with the weight of what had just transpired. Brian carried Emily in his arms, her small body trembling against his chest. Laura walked beside them, her face pale and drawn, her eyes darting to every shadow. The forest was quieter than before, the oppressive hum of the pack's energy seemingly replaced by an unnatural stillness. "Do you think it's really over?" Laura asked, her voice barely audible. Brian hesitated. He wanted to tell her yes, to offer her the reassurance she desperately needed, but he couldn't. The memory of Abigail's final warning lingered in his mind. "Be wary of its echoes." "I don't know," he admitted, his voice low, "but we have to believe it is, for Emily's sake." Laura nodded, though her expression remained troubled. As they reached the edge of the forest and the Parker house came into view, Emily stirred in Brian's arms. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and searching. "Daddy," she whispered. "I'm here, sweetheart," Brian said, his voice soft. "Is Mommy mad at me?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. Brian's heart clenched. "No, Emily. Mommy could never be mad at you. You were so brave tonight." Emily's lips quivered as tears welled in her eyes. "I didn't want to make her cry." Laura reached out, brushing Emily's hair back gently. "You didn't, baby," she said, her voice breaking. "You saved us." Emily's tears spilled over as she buried her face in Brian's shoulder. "I just want us to be together again," she sobbed. Brian held her tightly, his own tears threatening to fall. "We are together," he said, though the words felt hollow. He knew the echoes of the pact would linger, their presence a shadow over their lives. Back inside the house, Brian and Laura put Emily to bed, her exhaustion finally overtaking her fear. They lingered in her room, watching her sleep, her small hands clutching the edge of the blanket like a lifeline. "She's been through so much," Laura said, her voice barely above a whisper. Brian nodded, his gaze fixed on Emily's peaceful face. "And she'll carry it with her," he said, "just like we will." Laura turned to him, her eyes glistening with tears. "Do you think she'll ever be free of it?" Brian hesitated before answering. "I don't know, but we'll make sure she has the best life we can give her. That's all we can do." Laura nodded, though her expression remained troubled. "And us?" she asked. "Will we ever be free of it?" Brian turned to her, his hand brushing against her cheek. "As long as we have each other," he said, "we can handle anything." That night, Brian dreamed of Abigail. She stood in the forest clearing, her silver hair catching the pale light of an unseen moon. Her expression was unreadable, her piercing eyes fixed on him. "You've disrupted the cycle," she said, her voice echoing faintly. "But the pack's power cannot be so easily undone." Brian stepped forward, his chest tightening. "What does that mean?" "You said the cycle was broken." "I said it was disrupted," Abigail corrected. "But the bond remains. It is tied to the bloodline, to the choices made long before your time." "Then how do we end it?" Brian asked, his voice rising. "How do we make sure it doesn't come back?" Abigail's gaze softened, and for a moment, she almost looked sad. "Some truths are too deeply rooted to be erased. The pact is one of them." Brian's fists clenched. "That's not good enough." Abigail stepped closer, her voice quiet but firm. "The bloodline carries the weight of the pact, Brian. That weight will follow you, and it will follow Emily. But its echoes grow weaker with each disruption. The more you fight it, the harder it will be for the pact to reclaim its hold." Brian stared at her, his mind racing. "What are you saying? That we can outrun it?" "No," Abigail said, "but you can outlast it." Brian woke with a start, his chest heaving as the remnants of the dream faded. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the street lamp outside. He turned to see Laura asleep beside him, her breathing soft and even. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, his mind too restless to stay still. As he moved through the house, he found himself drawn to Emily's room. She was still asleep, her small form curled up under the blanket. Brian knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I'll protect you," he whispered, his voice trembling. "No matter what it takes." But even as he said the words, a cold dread settled in his chest. Abigail's warning echoed in his mind. The bond remains. The morning brought no comfort. The sun rose pale and cold over the Parker house, its light casting long, uneasy shadows. Brian sat at the kitchen table, a steaming mug of coffee in front of him, untouched. The journal lay open next to it, its brittle pages filled with Abigail's frantic scrawl. He read the same passage over and over. The echoes are subtle at first, but they grow stronger over time. They are not bound by place or time. They are bound by the bloodline. Brian's stomach churned. He had hoped that breaking the cycle, or at least disrupting it, would free Emily from the pack's grasp. But Abigail's words suggested otherwise. The echoes would remain, and they would come for Emily eventually. "Good morning," Laura said softly, her voice pulling him from his thoughts. She stood in the doorway, her arms crossed over her chest, her face pale and drawn. "Morning," Brian replied, his voice heavy with exhaustion. She walked to the table, her gaze falling on the journal. "Still looking for answers?" Brian nodded. "I can't stop thinking about what Abigail said. The bond's still there. The pact isn't done with us." Laura sat down across from him, her hands trembling as she wrapped them around her mug. "What do we do, Brian? How do we keep Emily safe?" Brian clenched his jaw. "We stay vigilant. We don't let our guard down. If the echoes come for her, we'll be ready." Laura's eyes filled with tears. "She's just a child. She doesn't deserve this." "I know," Brian said, his voice breaking, "but we'll do whatever it takes to protect her." Emily joined them at the table a short time later, her small face pale but determined. She clung to her stuffed bear, a faint tremor in her hands. "Are we safe now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Brian and Laura exchanged a glance before Brian nodded. "We're safe," he said, forcing the words out. Emily studied him, her wide eyes searching his face. "You're lying," she said softly. Brian's heart clenched. "Sweetheart, it's still here," Emily interrupted, her voice trembling. "I can feel it." Laura reached for her, pulling her into a hug. "We won't let anything happen to you," she said firmly. Emily didn't respond. She stared past them, her gaze fixed on the window. That night, the house felt heavier than ever. Every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the wind outside seemed charged with an unseen presence. Brian stayed awake, pacing through the house, his mind racing. Around midnight, the whispers began. At first, they were faint, like a distant echo. But as the minutes passed, they grew louder, clearer. "The bond remains. The bloodline must pay." Brian froze, his heart pounding. He turned toward Emily's room, his pulse quickening as the whispers seemed to converge there. He burst through the door, his flashlight sweeping across the room. Emily was sitting up in bed, her wide eyes filled with fear. "Daddy," she whispered. "It's here." Brian rushed to her, pulling her into his arms. "It's okay," he said, though his voice trembled. "I'm here. I've got you." The air in the room grew cold, the whispers intensifying. The symbols from the cabin and the chamber began to appear on the walls, glowing faintly. Laura ran into the room, her face pale. "What's happening?" "The echoes," Brian said, his voice tight. "They're here." The whispers grew louder, overlapping and chaotic. The glow of the symbols filled the room, their light pulsating like a heartbeat. Brian placed Emily in Laura's arms. "Get her out of here," he said, his voice firm. Laura hesitated. "What about you?" "I'll handle this," Brian said. "Go." Laura nodded reluctantly, clutching Emily tightly as she hurried out of the room. The symbols on the walls flared brighter, their energy crackling through the air. Brian stood in the center of the room, his fists clenched. "Enough," he shouted. "You've taken enough from us. Leave my family alone." The whispers fell silent, replaced by a low, resonant hum. The air grew heavier, pressing down on Brian like a physical weight. Then, a figure appeared in the doorway. It was Abigail. Her form was faint, almost translucent, but her piercing eyes were unmistakable. She stepped into the room, her gaze fixed on Brian. "The bond cannot be severed," she said, her voice calm but unyielding. "It is tied to the bloodline, to the choices that were made." Brian's jaw tightened. "We've made our choices. Emily is free." Abigail shook her head. "Freedom is an illusion. The pact will always seek balance." "Then I'll fight it," Brian said. "I'll fight it until my last breath." Abigail's expression softened slightly, a flicker of something like regret crossing her face. "You cannot fight what is eternal, but you can delay its grasp." Brian stepped forward, his fists trembling. "How?" Abigail hesitated before speaking. "The echoes grow weaker with each disruption. To protect Emily, you must bear the weight of the pact. The bloodline's burden must fall to you." Brian's chest tightened. "What does that mean?" "It means you will become the anchor," Abigail said. "You will carry the echoes, shielding the bloodline from their reach. But the cost will be great." Brian's breath caught. He thought of Emily, of her wide eyes filled with fear, and of Laura, her strength barely masking her heartbreak. "If it keeps them safe," he said, his voice steady, "then I'll do it." Abigail nodded, her expression solemn. "Then the bond will pass to you. But know this, the echoes will haunt you until the end of your days." Brian clenched his fists. "I can live with that, as long as Emily and Laura are free." Abigail raised her hands, the symbols on the walls flaring brighter. The room was filled with light, and the whispers returned, their chaotic voices converging into a deafening roar. Brian closed his eyes, his mind filled with thoughts of Emily and Laura. "For them, I would do anything." The light in the room swelled, consuming everything until Brian could no longer see the walls, the floor, or even Abigail's faint figure. He stood alone in an expanse of brilliant white, the whispers swirling around him like a storm. "The bond cannot be severed. The anchor must bear the weight." Brian's breath came in shallow gasps as the energy of the pact enveloped him. The whispers grew louder, their voices overlapping until they became a single, unified chant. "The bloodline will endure. The echoes shall remain." The light grew blinding, forcing Brian to shut his eyes. Pain flared through his chest, sharp and searing, as though the pact itself was carving its mark into his very soul. He fell to his knees, clutching his chest as the chant echoed in his mind. Then, as suddenly as it began, the light vanished. Brian opened his eyes to find himself back in Emily's room. The air was still, the symbols on the walls now dark and lifeless. The whispers were gone, leaving behind an oppressive silence. His body felt heavy, as though he were carrying an invisible weight. He pressed a hand to his chest, where the pain lingered like an ember. Beneath his fingers, his heart beat steadily. But there was something else, an unfamiliar sensation, a faint hum that seemed to resonate deep within him. "Brian?" He turned to see Laura standing in the doorway, her face pale and drawn. Emily peeked out from behind her, her wide eyes filled with worry. "Are you okay?" Laura asked, stepping into the room. Brian forced a weak smile. "I'm fine," he said, though his voice wavered. Laura's gaze dropped to his chest, where his hand rested. "What happened?" Brian hesitated. He didn't know how to explain what he had just experienced, how to put into words the weight now pressing down on him. "The pact," he said finally. "It's mine now." Laura's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" Brian took a deep breath, his gaze shifting to Emily. "The echoes won't come for her anymore. They won't come for you. They'll come for me." "No," Laura said, her voice trembling. "You can't." "It's done," Brian interrupted, his tone firm. "This was the only way to keep you both safe." Emily stepped forward, her small hands clutching the hem of Laura's shirt. "Daddy," she whispered. Brian knelt, pulling her into a hug. "It's okay, sweetheart," he said softly. "You're safe now. That's all that matters." The days that followed were quiet, but the weight of the pact lingered in every corner of the Parker house. Brian could feel it constantly, a low, steady hum that resonated deep within him, a reminder of the burden he now carried. At first, it was subtle, shadows in the corners of his vision that disappeared when he turned to look. Faint whispers in the dead of night, their words just beyond his understanding. He kept it from Laura and Emily, determined to shield them from the truth. But as the days turned into weeks, the echoes grew stronger. One night, as Brian stood in the kitchen, staring blankly at the journal spread out before him, he felt it. A presence behind him, cold and oppressive. He turned slowly, his breath catching in his throat. A figure stood in the doorway, its form cloaked in shadow. "You cannot escape," the figure said, its voice low and resonant. Brian clenched his fists. "I'm not trying to escape," he said. "I'm taking this so they don't have to." The figure stepped closer, its shadowy form solidifying into something more human-like. Its face was pale and gaunt, its eyes dark and hollow. "The echoes will not relent," it said. "The pact will demand its due. Then it can take it from me," Brian said firmly. "Leave my family out of this." The figure tilted its head, its expression unreadable. "You cannot hold back the tide forever. The bloodline will always be bound." Brian stepped forward, his jaw tightening. "Maybe, but as long as I'm here, it won't touch them." The figure studied him for a long moment before fading into the shadows. Brian's nights became battles against the whispers and the shadows, his sleep plagued by visions of Abigail and the Pact's origins. During the day, he did his best to maintain a semblance of normalcy for Emily and Laura, but the weight of the Pact took its toll. He grew quieter, more withdrawn, the strain evident in the lines of his face. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Laura reached for his hand. "You're carrying this all alone," she said softly. Brian squeezed her hand, his gaze fixed on Emily, who was drawing at the coffee table. "I have to," he said. "No, you don't," Laura said, her voice breaking. "We're in this together. You don't have to shut us out." Brian turned to her, his eyes filled with both love and sorrow. "I can't let you share this," he said. "You've both been through enough." Laura leaned closer, her grip on his hand tightening. "You're not the only one who loves her, Brian. Don't push me away." Her words broke something inside him, and for the first time since taking on the pact, he allowed himself to cry. Laura pulled him into an embrace, her tears mingling with his. "We'll figure this out," she said, her voice steady despite her tears. "We'll find a way to stop it for good." Brian nodded, though deep down, he wasn't sure if the pact could ever truly be broken. That night, as Brian lay awake, staring at the ceiling, he felt a flicker of hope. The echoes were relentless, but they hadn't taken him yet. Perhaps, with time, they could find a way to end the pact once and for all. But as the shadows gathered in the corners of the room and the whispers began anew, he knew one thing for certain. The fight was far from over. Brian woke to the sound of Emily's soft cries. The faint light of dawn seeped through the curtains, casting long, jagged shadows across the room. His body ached from the weight of the pact, the constant hum in his chest like an unrelenting reminder of what he now carried. "Emily," he called, sitting up. Her voice floated to him from the hallway. "Daddy?" Brian was on his feet in an instant, his heart pounding. He found her standing in the hallway, clutching her stuffed bear tightly, her small body trembling. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" Brian knelt, brushing her hair back gently. "I heard them again," Emily whispered, her wide eyes glistening with tears. Brian's stomach sank. "Heard who?" "The voices," Emily said, her voice trembling. "They were in my room. They said it's not over." Brian's breath hitched. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her close. "It's okay," he said softly. "I'm here. Nothing's going to hurt you." But even as he said the words, a cold dread crept into his chest. He had taken on the Pact's burden to protect Emily, but its echoes were still reaching for her. Over breakfast, Brian and Laura exchanged worried glances while Emily poked at her food, her usual bright demeanor replaced with quiet unease. "Do you think she's still connected to it?" Laura asked in a low voice as Emily wandered into the living room. Brian rubbed his temples, his exhaustion evident. "I don't know," he admitted. "I thought taking on the pact would sever her ties to it. But maybe it's deeper than that." Laura's hand tightened around her coffee mug. "We can't keep living like this, Brian. We need answers." Brian nodded. "I know." Abigail said the echoes grow weaker with each disruption, but she also said the pact is eternal. There has to be a way to end it completely. Laura hesitated. "Do you think we can trust her?" Brian's jaw tightened. "I don't know, but she's the only one who seems to understand this. If there's any chance she can help us, I have to find her." That night, Brian returned to the forest. He followed the faint hum that seemed to emanate from deep within him, letting it guide him through the dark, twisting paths. The air was heavy, the silence broken only by the crunch of leaves beneath his boots. The cabin appeared ahead, its outline stark against the moonlit sky. Brian hesitated at the threshold, his hand hovering over the door handle. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The interior was dark and cold, the faint scent of pine and smoke lingering in the air. The room was empty, but the energy of the pact pulsed faintly, as though the space itself was alive. "Abigail," Brian called, his voice echoing. "I know you're here." The air shifted, and Abigail's faint figure appeared in the corner of the room. Her silver hair shimmered faintly, her piercing eyes locking onto his. "You've come for answers," she said, her voice calm. Brian stepped forward, his fists clenched. "The pact is still reaching for Emily," he said. "I thought taking it on would protect her, but it hasn't." Abigail tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "The pact is bound to the bloodline. Taking on the burden shields her from its immediate grasp, but the connection remains. The echoes will always seek her." Brian's chest tightened. "Then how do I end it? How do I make sure it never touches her again?" Abigail's gaze darkened. "To sever the pact completely would require undoing what was done. You would have to unmake the choice that bound the bloodline to it in the first place." Brian's mind raced. "You mean, go back? To the moment it started?" Abigail nodded. "The dagger holds the power to disrupt the bond. But to truly unmake the pact, you must return to its origin and confront the force that created it." "What force?" Brian demanded. "What created the pact?" Abigail hesitated, her expression flickering with unease. "The pact was not made with mere words or rituals. It was forged with blood and bound to an entity beyond this world. To unmake it would mean confronting that entity and offering a counterbalance." Brian's pulse quickened. "What kind of counterbalance?" Abigail's voice softened. "A greater sacrifice than any made before." Brian returned home, his mind racing with Abigail's words. The weight of what she had told him pressed heavily on his chest. To protect Emily and Laura, to sever the pact once and for all, he would have to confront the very force that had created it. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at the dagger that now lay before him. Its surface gleamed faintly, the intricate symbols etched into its blade pulsing with an otherworldly energy. Laura entered the room, her expression filled with concern. "What did you find out?" she asked. Brian hesitated before meeting her gaze. "There's a way to end it," he said, "but it's dangerous, and it requires going back to the beginning." Laura's brow furrowed. "What does that mean?" "It means confronting whatever force Abigail made the pact with," Brian said, "and offering something in return. A sacrifice greater than any made before." Laura's face paled. "Brian, no, you can't." "I have to," Brian interrupted, his voice firm. "If I don't, this will never end. Emily will never be safe." Tears filled Laura's eyes. "But what if you don't come back? What if it takes you?" Brian reached for her hand, his grip steady despite the fear in his heart. "If that's what it takes to protect you and Emily, then it's worth it." Laura shook her head, her tears spilling over. "There has to be another way." "There isn't," Brian said softly. "This is the only way to make sure the pact dies with me." As the night deepened, Brian prepared himself for what lay ahead. The dagger pulsed faintly in his hand, its energy resonating with the hum that now lived within him. He kissed Emily on the forehead as she slept, his heart breaking as he whispered, "I love you." Laura stood in the doorway, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "Promise me you'll come back," she said, her voice trembling. Brian hesitated before pulling her into a hug. "I promise I'll do everything I can," he said. But as he stepped out into the cold night air, he couldn't shake the feeling that this journey would be his last. The forest was darker than Brian remembered, the trees towering above him like silent sentinels. The dagger in his hand pulsed faintly, its glow the only light guiding his way. The path beneath his feet twisted and turned, each step feeling heavier than the last. Abigail's words echoed in his mind. To unmake the pact, you must confront the force that created it. He didn't know what awaited him at the end of the path, but he knew one thing. He would face it, no matter the cost. The air grew colder as he walked, the oppressive silence broken only by the crunch of leaves beneath his boots. Shadows flickered at the edges of his vision, and faint whispers floated through the air, their words indistinct but filled with an unsettling urgency. "Brian?" He froze. The voice was soft, familiar. He turned, his heart pounding. "Laura?" he called, but the forest remained still. "Brian, don't do this." The voice came again, closer this time. He turned in a slow circle, his grip tightening on the dagger. "Laura, if that's you." "It's not." The voice was sharp and clear, cutting through the air like a knife. Brian's stomach dropped as a figure stepped out from the shadows. It was Abigail. Her silver hair glinted faintly in the dagger's glow, her piercing eyes locking onto his. She moved with an eerie grace, her presence commanding yet unsettling. "You shouldn't have come here," she said, her voice low. Brian's jaw tightened. "I don't have a choice. You said it yourself. The pact won't stop until it's ended." Abigail's expression darkened. "You don't understand what you're walking into. The force that created the pact is not bound by our world. It will demand more than you can give." Brian stepped closer, his voice firm. "I've already given everything. My family has given everything. I'm not stopping now." Abigail hesitated, her gaze flickering with something like regret. "If you go through with this, there's no guarantee you'll succeed. And if you fail..." She trailed off, her voice heavy with unspoken consequences. Brian squared his shoulders. "I have to try." Abigail studied him for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Then follow me," she said. They walked in silence, the forest growing darker and colder with each step. The whispers grew louder, their fragmented words swirling around Brian like a storm. "The bond remains. The bloodline must pay." Brian clenched his fists, his resolve hardening. The path ended abruptly at the edge of a cliff. Below, a swirling vortex of shadow and light churned, its energy pulsing with an unnatural rhythm. The air crackled with power, the hum resonating in Brian's chest like a second heartbeat. "This is the source," Abigail said, her voice quiet. "The place where the pact was forged." Brian stepped to the edge, staring down into the swirling void. "What do I do?" Abigail turned to him, her expression grave. "The dagger is the key. You must enter the vortex and face the force that created the pact. But be warned, it will test you. It will demand a sacrifice greater than any you've made before." Brian tightened his grip on the dagger. "If it means ending this, I'll do whatever it takes." Abigail hesitated, her gaze softening. "You are braver than I ever was," she said. "But bravery alone may not be enough." Before Brian could respond, the ground beneath his feet trembled. The vortex pulsed, its energy pulling at him like an invisible tether. "It's time," Abigail said, stepping back. "Go." Brian took a deep breath, his mind filled with thoughts of Laura and Emily. "I love you," he whispered, before stepping into the void. The descent was immediate and overwhelming. The vortex swallowed him whole, its energy pressing against him from all sides. The hum grew deafening, the light and shadow around him twisting and blending until he could no longer distinguish up from down. When he landed, it was on solid ground, though the air around him was thick and suffocating. He stood in a vast, empty space, its boundaries obscured by a swirling mist. A voice echoed through the void, low and resonant. "You have come to unmake the pact." Brian turned, searching for the source of the voice. "Yes," he said, his voice steady. The mist shifted, coalescing into a towering figure cloaked in shadow. Its form was indistinct, its presence oppressive. "Why do you seek to undo what was done?" the voice asked. Brian's grip on the dagger tightened. "Because it's destroyed my family. It's taken everything from us." The figure tilted its head, its eyes, if it had any, boring into him. "The pact was forged to save the bloodline. It has ensured your survival. At what cost?" Brian shot back. "How many lives have been sacrificed? How many generations have suffered?" The figure was silent for a moment before speaking again. "The bloodline carries the weight of its choices. To sever the bond would require a sacrifice greater than all those before." Brian's chest tightened. "What kind of sacrifice?" "Your soul," the figure said. "To unmake the pact, you must offer yourself completely. Your essence will be consumed, leaving nothing behind. Not even memory." Brian's breath caught. "What do you mean?" "You will cease to exist," the figure said. "Your sacrifice will erase the pact and its echoes, but it will also erase you. Your family will be free, but they will never know you existed." Brian's mind raced. He thought of Emily's smile, Laura's laugh, the life they had built together. The thought of losing them, of erasing himself from their lives, was almost too much to bear. But then he thought of Emily's fear, Laura's heartbreak, and the weight they would carry if the pact remained. "I'll do it," he said, his voice steady. The figure loomed closer, its presence overwhelming. "You are certain?" Brian nodded. "I'm certain." The figure raised a hand, the mist swirling around Brian as the hum grew louder. "Then it is done." The void erupted with light, the energy of the pact exploding outward. Brian's body was consumed, his form dissolving into the mist. He felt no pain, only a profound sense of peace. As his consciousness faded, his final thought was of Emily and Laura. They're free. Laura woke with a start, her heart racing as though she'd been running in her sleep. The house was silent, the faint light of dawn filtering through the curtains. She reached for Brian's side of the bed, but her hand met only cold, empty sheets. "Brian," she called, her voice trembling. The only response was the distant creak of the floorboards. She hurried out of bed and checked Emily's room. Her heart eased slightly when she found her daughter sleeping soundly, her small body curled around her stuffed bear. But the relief was short-lived. Brian wasn't there. Downstairs, the kitchen was empty, the coffee pot untouched. Laura's stomach twisted as she noticed the absence of Brian's coat and boots. The air felt heavier than usual, as if the house itself was holding its breath. A memory from the night before surfaced. Brian kissing her and Emily goodnight, the way he'd lingered just a moment longer, his expression unreadable. "I promise I'll do everything I can," he had said. Laura's breath caught. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "He wouldn't." She rushed to the front door, flinging it open. The cold morning air bit at her skin as her eyes scanned the horizon. The path to the forest stretched out before her, empty and foreboding. "Brian!" she shouted, her voice echoing into the stillness. But there was no answer. Hours passed, and Laura's worry turned to dread. She scoured the house, searching for any sign of where Brian might have gone. It was only when she checked the kitchen table that she found it. A single piece of paper, folded neatly and resting beneath his wedding band. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it. "Laura, I love you and Emily more than anything. That's why I have to do this. The pact won't stop until it's ended for good. And I'm the only one who can make sure it never touches you or Emily again. Please don't try to find me. Just know that you're free now. Live the life you deserve. Forever yours, Brian ****. Laura sank into the chair, her tears falling onto the page. She clutched the letter to her chest, her sobs breaking the stillness of the room. As the days passed, Laura tried to make sense of Brian's disappearance. The forest was silent and unyielding, offering no clues to where he had gone. Emily asked about him constantly, her innocent questions breaking Laura's heart. "Where's Daddy?" Emily asked one afternoon, her wide eyes filled with worry. Laura forced a smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Daddy had to go away for a little while. she said softly. Will he come back? Emily asked, clutching her stuffed bear tightly. Laura hesitated, her throat tightening. I hope so, sweetheart, she said, her voice trembling. But deep down, she wasn't sure if Brian would ever return. Weeks turned into months, and the weight of Brian's absence became a constant presence in the Parker household. Laura did her best to move forward for Emily's sake, but the unanswered questions lingered like ghosts. One night, as she tucked Emily into bed, her daughter looked up at her with solemn eyes. Mommy, Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. I had a dream about Daddy. Laura's heart skipped a beat. What kind of dream, sweetheart? Emily hesitated, her small hands clutching the blanket. He was standing in the forest, she said. He said he loves us and that we're safe now. Tears filled Laura's eyes as she stroked Emily's hair. He does love us, she said softly, and he wanted us to be safe more than anything. Emily nodded, her gaze drifting to the window. I think he's still watching over us. Laura's breath hitched. Maybe he is, she said, her voice trembling. That night, as Laura lay in bed, she felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time since Brian's disappearance, the oppressive weight of the pact seemed to have lifted. The whispers were gone, the shadows in the corners of the house no longer shifting. But as she drifted off to sleep, a single thought lingered in her mind. What did Brian sacrifice to keep them safe? Months turned into a year, and life at the Parker house began to settle into a fragile rhythm. The echoes of the pact seemed to have vanished, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. The oppressive weight that had once hung over the family was gone, but so was Brian. Laura did her best to shield Emily from the pain of his absence, throwing herself into creating a semblance of normalcy. She enrolled Emily in a local art class, signed her up for summer activities, and filled the house with the warmth of new traditions. But every quiet moment brought memories of Brian, and the question that haunted her: what price did he pay? It was on a late spring afternoon, as Laura sifted through an old box of photographs in the attic, that she stumbled upon something unexpected. The photo was black and white, its edges frayed with age. It depicted a young woman standing in front of a small cabin, her features unmistakably similar to Laura's. The woman was Abigail. Laura's heart raced as she flipped the photo over. Written on the back in faded ink were the words, "The beginning lies in the bloodline." Laura sat back on her heels, her mind spinning. Brian had taken on the burden of the pact to protect their family, but it seemed Abigail had always intended for the Parker bloodline to carry its weight. "What did you do, Abigail?" Laura whispered, her hands trembling. That evening, Laura sat at the kitchen table, the photograph spread out before her. She had pulled out the journal, its brittle pages filled with Abigail's desperate writings. One passage caught her eye. The echoes grow weaker with each disruption, but the anchor remains. The bloodline cannot escape its destiny. Laura traced the words with her finger, her mind racing. If Brian had become the anchor, had he truly freed Emily and her from the pact? Or was this only a temporary reprieve? Her thoughts were interrupted by Emily's voice. "Mommy, what are you looking at?" Laura quickly folded the photograph and set it aside. "Just some old pictures, sweetheart." Emily climbed into her lap, her small hands reaching for the journal. "Is that Daddy's book?" Laura hesitated. "It's something your daddy was reading," she said carefully. Emily studied the journal, her wide eyes filled with curiosity. "Is it about the cabin?" Laura's breath caught. "Why do you ask that?" Emily shrugged. "I had another dream," she said softly. "Daddy was at the cabin. He said it was okay to let go." That night, Laura couldn't sleep. Emily's words replayed in her mind, filling her with both hope and dread. What did Brian mean by letting go? Had his sacrifice truly freed them, or was the pact still waiting for its chance to resurface? Unable to shake the feeling that something was unresolved, Laura made a decision. She needed to return to the cabin. The forest was quieter than Laura remembered, its usual sounds of life replaced by an unsettling stillness. The path to the cabin was overgrown, as though the forest itself was trying to erase its existence. When she reached the clearing, Laura's breath caught. The cabin stood untouched, its weathered walls casting long shadows in the fading light. She hesitated at the threshold, her hand hovering over the door handle. Memories of the last time she had been here, of Brian's determined expression, of Emily's trembling hands, flooded her mind. Steeling herself, she pushed the door open. The interior of the cabin was dark and cold, the faint scent of smoke and pine lingering in the air. Laura's flashlight cast long, flickering shadows across the walls, illuminating the symbols that had haunted her family for generations. At the center of the room, where Brian had stood to confront Abigail, the faint glow of the pack's energy lingered. Laura felt it in her chest, a low hum that resonated deep within her. "What are you still doing here?" she whispered. The air shifted, and a faint voice echoed through the room. "Laura?" She froze, her heart pounding. "Brian?" The voice grew clearer, filled with a familiar warmth and sadness. "You shouldn't have come." Tears filled Laura's eyes as she turned in circles, searching for him. "Where are you? What's happening?" The glow at the center of the room pulsed, and for a brief moment, Brian's figure appeared. He was translucent, his form faint and flickering like a dying flame. "I told you not to look for me," he said, his voice filled with both love and regret. Laura stepped closer, her hands trembling. "You're here. You're still here." "I'm the anchor now," Brian said. "The pack's echoes are bound to me. It's the only way to keep you and Emily safe." Laura shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "This isn't right. You shouldn't have to carry this alone." Brian's gaze softened. "It's done, Laura. You and Emily are free. That's all that matters." "No," Laura said firmly. "We're not free if you're not with us." The room trembled, the symbols on the walls flaring with light. Brian's form began to fade, his expression pained. "You have to let me go," he said. "If you try to undo this, the pact will find another way. It will come for Emily." Laura reached for him, her voice breaking. "I can't lose you." "You haven't," Brian said softly. "I'll always be with you. In every memory, every moment. But you have to live. For Emily. For both of us." As his figure dissolved into the light, his final words echoed through the room. "Let go, Laura. Let go." When Laura emerged from the forest, the first rays of dawn were breaking through the trees. The weight that had pressed on her chest since Brian's disappearance felt lighter, though her heart still ached. As she approached the house, she saw Emily waiting on the porch, her small face illuminated by the golden light of morning. "Mommy?" Emily called, her voice filled with hope. Laura knelt, pulling Emily into her arms. "Daddy loves you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "And he's watching over us." Emily nodded, her small arms wrapping tightly around her mother. "I know," she said softly. "I dreamed it." The morning air was crisp as Laura and Emily stepped into the forest, the small wooden box securely tucked into Laura's bag. The path before them seemed to shift and ripple, the symbols etched into the trees glowing faintly as though guiding their way. Emily held tightly to Laura's hand, her small fingers trembling despite her brave expression. "Do you think we'll see Daddy?" she asked softly. Laura's chest tightened. "I don't know, sweetheart," she said, her voice trembling. "But I know he'd want us to be strong." Emily nodded, her grip tightening. As they walked deeper into the forest, the air grew heavier, the silence broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves. The path twisted and turned, leading them to places that felt both familiar and entirely new. After what felt like hours, they emerged into a clearing. At its center was a stone altar, weathered and cracked, its surface covered in intricate carvings that mirrored the symbols on the box. The air around the altar seemed to hum with energy, a low, resonant vibration that made the hairs on the back of Laura's neck stand on end. "This is it," Laura said, her voice barely above a whisper. Emily stepped closer, her wide eyes fixed on the altar. "What do we do now?" Laura hesitated before pulling the wooden box from her bag. She opened it carefully, removing the vial of blood and the folded parchment containing Abigail's instructions. She unfolded the parchment, her hands trembling as she read the final step of the ritual. "Place the blood on the altar and speak the words of severance." The bond will be broken, but the cost will be great. Laura swallowed hard, her gaze shifting to Emily. Stay back, she said firmly. I need you to stay safe. Emily nodded, though her small hands clutched at her bear nervously. Laura stepped toward the altar, the vial of blood clutched tightly in her hand. As she approached, the hum of energy grew louder, the symbols on the stone glowing brighter. She placed the vial on the altar and took a deep breath. I sever the bond, she said, her voice steady. I unmake the pact. The air around her seemed to ripple, the hum growing into a deafening roar. The vial shattered, the dark liquid spilling across the altar and soaking into the stone. Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet trembled, and the clearing was filled with blinding light. When the light faded, Laura found herself standing in an unfamiliar place. The forest was gone, replaced by a vast, empty expanse of mist and shadow. Mommy? Emily's voice called, faint and distant. Emily! Laura shouted, panic gripping her chest. The mist swirled around her, and a figure began to emerge. Laura's breath caught as the figure solidified into someone she recognized. Brian. He stood before her, his expression both pained and resolute. Laura, he said, his voice filled with sorrow. Laura ran to him, her hands gripping his arms as though afraid he would disappear. You're here, she said, her voice breaking. I knew I'd find you. Brian shook his head, his eyes filled with regret. You shouldn't have come. Tears streamed down Laura's face. I had to. We found Abigail's letters. She said this was the only way to end it. Brian's jaw tightened. She didn't tell you everything, he said. What do you mean? Laura asked, her voice trembling. Brian hesitated before speaking. The pact isn't just bound to the bloodline. It's tied to this place, this force. Breaking the bond means confronting it, and it won't let you leave without a price. Laura's stomach twisted. What kind of price? Brian's gaze softened. It will demand a life, he said. One of us has to stay. No, Laura said, shaking her head. That's not fair. You've already sacrificed so much. It's not about fairness, Brian said. It's about ending this once and for all. The mist began to thicken, swirling around them with an oppressive force. The faint hum of the pact grew louder, resonating in Laura's chest. Choose, a voice boomed, low and resonant. Who will remain? Laura clutched Brian's arm, her heart racing. There has to be another way, she said. Brian turned to her, his expression filled with love. This is the only way, he said softly. You and Emily need to go back. You need to live. Tears streamed down Laura's face as she shook her head. No, I can't do this without you. You can, Brian said, his voice firm. You're stronger than you think. The mist closed in, the voice growing louder. Choose. Brian stepped forward, placing his hand on Laura's cheek. Take care of Emily, he said, and tell her I love her. Before Laura could respond, the mist enveloped him, his form dissolving into the swirling void. Laura woke with a start, gasping for breath. She was back in the clearing, the altar dark and lifeless. Emily was at her side, her wide eyes filled with fear. Mommy, she asked, her voice trembling. Laura pulled her into a tight hug, her tears falling onto Emily's hair. It's okay, she said, though her heart ached. It's over now. As they made their way back through the forest, Laura couldn't shake the feeling that Brian's presence was still with them, lingering in the faint hum of the air. He was gone, but his sacrifice had given them freedom. For the first time in years, the weight of the pact was gone. The house was quieter than it had ever been. The oppressive energy that had once filled every corner was gone, replaced by an unfamiliar stillness. Laura and Emily returned from the forest with heavy hearts but lighter spirits, knowing that Brian's sacrifice had brought them a measure of peace. For weeks, Laura tried to adjust to the absence of the pact and the absence of Brian. She threw herself into taking care of Emily, finding solace in their routines and the small moments of joy that Emily brought into their days. But late at night, when the house was dark and silent, Laura couldn't escape the ache in her chest. The memory of Brian's final words haunted her. Take care of Emily, and tell her I love her. She had told Emily, of course, every day, but it didn't make the loss any easier to bear. One evening, as Laura was tidying up the living room, she found the box from the cabin sitting on the coffee table. She hesitated, her fingers brushing against its surface. The vial of blood was gone, used in the ritual, but the letters and parchment remained. She pulled out Abigail's final letter, her eyes scanning the faded words. To sever the bond, the blood must be returned to the altar where the pact was forged, and the force confronted. Only then can the bloodline be freed. Laura's brow furrowed. The bond was broken, the pact severed, but Abigail's letter suggested something deeper, something unresolved. As she read the letter again, a single phrase stood out. The bloodline carries the weight of its choices. Laura's stomach turned. What choices had Brian made to protect them? And was the pact truly gone, or had it simply shifted its focus? That night, Laura had a dream. She stood in the clearing, the altar dark and cracked. The forest around her was alive with whispers, the faint echoes of voices she couldn't quite make out. Then she saw him. Brian stood at the edge of the clearing, his form faint and flickering like a reflection on water. He looked at her with the same mixture of love and sorrow that had filled his eyes before he disappeared. "Laura," he said, his voice soft. Tears filled her eyes as she stepped toward him. "Brian," she whispered, "I miss you so much." "I miss you too," he said. "But this isn't over." Her breath hitched. "What do you mean?" "We broke the pact. You said we were free." Brian's expression darkened. "The bond is severed, but the echoes remain. They'll come back, stronger than before. If the bloodline forgets." Laura shook her head, her tears falling freely. "How do we stop them?" "You don't," Brian said. "You carry the memory. You tell Emily the truth. The pact can't be undone, but it can be weakened if we remember." The whispers grew louder, the forest darkening around them. Brian's form began to fade, his voice breaking through the growing chaos. "Don't let her forget, Laura. Don't let her forget." Laura woke with a start, her heart pounding. The house was dark and silent, but the faint hum of the pact lingered in the air. She sat up, her mind racing with Brian's words. "Don't let her forget." She looked at the box on the nightstand, its carvings glowing faintly in the moonlight. The pact was broken, but its echoes remained, tied to the bloodline through memory. Laura knew what she had to do. The next morning, Laura sat with Emily at the kitchen table, the box between them. "Emily," Laura said gently, "there's something I need to tell you about our family." Emily looked up from her cereal, her wide eyes filled with curiosity. "What is it, Mommy?" Laura hesitated, her chest tightening. "It's about Daddy, and about the pact." For the first time, Laura told Emily the full story, about Abigail, the pact, and the sacrifices their family had made. She told her about Brian's courage, his love, and the price he had paid to protect them. Emily listened intently, her small hands clutching her bear tightly. When Laura finished, Emily's eyes were filled with tears. "Daddy did all that for us?" she asked softly. Laura nodded, her own tears falling. "He loved us more than anything. He wanted to make sure we were safe." Emily reached for Laura's hand, her small fingers trembling. "I won't forget, Mommy. Promise." Laura pulled her into a hug, her heart swelling with both pride and sorrow. "That's all he wanted, sweetheart," she said. "For us to remember." As the weeks passed, Laura began to notice subtle changes in the house. The oppressive weight of the pact was gone, replaced by a faint sense of warmth and peace. The whispers had faded, and the shadows no longer lingered in the corners. But the memory of Brian remained, strong, vivid, and ever-present. Laura and Emily kept the box on a small shelf in the living room, its contents a reminder of the sacrifices their family had made. They spoke of Brian often, sharing stories and memories that kept his presence alive. And though the echoes of the pact still lingered faintly, Laura knew that as long as they remembered, they could face whatever came next. The summer air hung heavy with the scent of pine as Laura and Emily ventured outside, the weight of their shared history casting a solemn yet oddly comforting presence around them. The Parker house stood silent behind them, its windows catching the golden light of late afternoon. Emily clutched her sketchpad as they walked toward the garden Brian had started the year before. It was overgrown now, the flowers wild and untamed, but Emily loved to sit there and draw. "Are we going to see Daddy again?" Emily asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Laura's chest tightened. She knelt beside Emily, brushing a stray curl from her daughter's face. "I don't know, sweetheart," she said honestly, "but I think he's always with us in some way." Emily nodded thoughtfully. "I think he's in the garden," she said, pointing toward the tall sunflowers that swayed gently in the breeze. Laura smiled faintly, though her heart ached. "Maybe he is," she said softly. That evening, as Laura tucked Emily into bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching over them. The house was quiet, almost unnaturally so, but it didn't feel empty. She sat by Emily's bed for a while, her fingers brushing over the cover of the storybook she had read aloud. Emily was already asleep, her small hand resting on her bare. Laura leaned down and kissed her forehead. "Good night, my brave girl," she whispered. As she turned to leave, she caught sight of the box on the shelf. Its carvings seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight, a subtle reminder of everything they had endured. For a moment, Laura thought she heard a faint whisper, a voice that sent a shiver down her spine and warmth through her heart at the same time. Take care of her. The days that followed were filled with quiet moments of reflection. Laura pored over the letters in the box, seeking to understand the full scope of Abigail's warnings and Brian's sacrifice. Each word seemed to carry a weight she hadn't noticed before, as if the pact's influence lingered in the ink. One passage stood out. "The echoes will fade with time, but they are never truly gone. Memory binds them. Love weakens them." Laura traced the words with her finger, her heart swelling with resolve. They had endured so much, sacrificed so much, but they had also held on to each other. That love, she realized, was their greatest strength. One evening, as Laura prepared dinner, she heard Emily's voice from the living room. "Hi, Daddy." The knife clattered from Laura's hand as she rushed into the room. She found Emily sitting on the rug, her sketchpad open in front of her. "What did you say, sweetheart?" Laura asked, her voice trembling. Emily looked up with a bright smile. "I was talking to Daddy," she said simply, pointing to the chair in the corner of the room. Laura's breath caught as she followed Emily's gaze. The chair was empty, but the air around it seemed to shimmer faintly, as though something unseen lingered just out of reach. "What did Daddy say?" Laura asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Emily tilted her head thoughtfully. "He said he's proud of us, and that he loves us." Tears filled Laura's eyes as she knelt beside Emily, pulling her into a tight hug. "We love him too," she whispered. That night, Laura stood in the doorway of her bedroom, staring at the empty space beside her bed. She missed Brian with an ache that never quite went away, but there was a new sense of peace in her heart. She climbed into bed, pulling the blanket up to her chin. As she drifted off to sleep, she felt a faint warmth beside her, as if someone were there, watching over her. For the first time in a long time, her dreams were filled with light. The next morning, Laura woke to the sound of birdsong. The sunlight streamed through the windows, casting golden rays across the room. She felt lighter, as though a weight had been lifted from her chest. She found Emily in the garden, sketching beneath the sunflowers. "What are you drawing?" Laura asked, kneeling beside her. Emily held up her sketchpad. The drawing was simple but beautiful. A family of 3 standing in a field of sunflowers, their faces bright with joy. "It's us," Emily said, her voice filled with quiet certainty. "All of us." Laura smiled, her heart swelling with love and pride. "It's perfect," she said. Emily looked up at her, her eyes shining. "Do you think Daddy likes it?" Laura wrapped an arm around her daughter's shoulders. "I think he loves it," she said, "just like he loves us." The warm days of summer melted into the cool crispness of autumn, and with the change of seasons, Laura found herself reflecting more deeply on the legacy of the pact. The box with its carved symbols remained on the shelf, a quiet reminder of the past they had fought so hard to escape. But life in the Parker house was slowly healing. Emily thrived in her art class, her sketches filling the walls of her bedroom with vibrant depictions of sunflowers, family scenes, and the occasional mysterious figure that bore an uncanny resemblance to Brian. "Daddy's watching," she would say whenever Laura commented on her work. And though it brought a pang of sadness, Laura also felt comforted. One evening, as Laura prepared dinner, the air in the house shifted. It wasn't heavy or oppressive as it had been when the pack's influence loomed over them, but it carried a subtle energy that prickled at the edge of her awareness. Emily ran into the kitchen, clutching her sketchpad. "Mommy, look what I made," she said excitedly, holding up a new drawing. Laura turned, smiling as she took the sketchpad. The drawing depicted the cabin in the forest, its weathered exterior rendered in careful detail. In the foreground stood a man, Brian. "He said he's still at the cabin," Emily said matter-of-factly, climbing onto a chair. Laura froze. "He told you that?" Emily nodded, her small fingers fidgeting with the hem of her shirt. "In my dream last night, he said there's something we need to find. Something he left for us." Laura's stomach twisted. She had thought her last visit to the cabin had closed that chapter, but Emily's words brought a fresh wave of unease. "What did he say it was?" Laura asked, her voice trembling. Emily shrugged. "He just said we'd know when we saw it." That night, Laura couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, Brian's words from Emily's dream echoing in her mind. "There's something we need to find." The thought of returning to the cabin filled her with dread, but she couldn't ignore the possibility that Brian had left something important behind. In the early hours of the morning, Laura made her decision. She would go back, alone. The forest was eerily quiet as Laura made her way toward the cabin. The path was overgrown, the trees arching over her like a tunnel. The air was colder than she remembered, each breath forming small clouds in the crisp autumn air. When she reached the clearing, the cabin stood in shadow, its weathered exterior blending into the gloom. Laura hesitated at the threshold, her hand hovering over the door handle. A part of her wanted to turn back, to leave the past buried. But Brian's words, spoken through Emily, propelled her forward. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The interior of the cabin was just as she had left it, dark, cold, and silent. The symbols carved into the walls were faint now, their once vivid glow reduced to a barely perceptible shimmer. Laura scanned the room, her flashlight sweeping over the floor and furniture. Nothing seemed out of place. She moved to the center of the room, where the faint energy of the pact had lingered during her last visit. The floorboards beneath her feet creaked, and she froze. The sound was different this time, hollow. Laura knelt, running her hands over the floorboards. One of them shifted slightly under her touch. She pried it up, revealing a small compartment. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its cover cracked with age. Laura's breath caught as she picked it up, her fingers trembling. She opened it carefully, the brittle pages filled with Brian's familiar handwriting. The first entry stopped her cold. "If you're reading this, it means you've found the last piece of the puzzle. I couldn't tell you everything before. I didn't want you to carry this burden. But now you need to know the truth." Laura's heart pounded as she flipped through the pages. The journal detailed Brian's journey after taking on the burden of the pact, the visions he had experienced, the whispers that had followed him, and the force he had confronted in the void. But it was the final entry that shook her to her core. The pact was broken, but its echoes are bound to memory. If we forget, they will return stronger than before. The bloodline's survival depends on holding onto the past, no matter how painful it is. But there is one more truth you need to know. The pact's origins are not bound to Abigail or me. They go deeper, far deeper than we ever realized. The force behind it is tied to something ancient, something that cannot be fully severed. Laura, if you're reading this, know that you and Emily are my greatest loves. And though I can no longer be with you, I'll always watch over you. Never forget that. Laura's hands shook as she closed the journal. The weight of Brian's words settled heavily on her chest. The pact's origins were deeper than Abigail's desperate bargain. It was a legacy far older and darker than she had imagined. When Laura returned home, Emily was waiting for her in the living room. "Did you find it?" Emily asked, her eyes wide with curiosity. Laura nodded, holding up the journal. "Daddy left us this," she said. Emily climbed into her lap, her small hands resting on the worn cover. "What does it say?" "It says we need to remember," Laura said softly, "that as long as we hold onto our memories, the pact can't hurt us." Emily nodded solemnly. "I'll never forget, Mommy. Promise." Laura hugged her tightly, her tears falling onto Emily's hair. And though the echoes of the pact still lingered faintly in the back of her mind, Laura felt a renewed sense of purpose. They would remember. They would carry the past, no matter how heavy, to protect the future. The first frost of winter had settled over the Parker house, its white crystalline touch softening the edges of the world outside. Inside, the warmth of a crackling fire filled the living room, casting a golden glow over Emily as she sat on the rug, her sketchpad in her lap. Laura sat nearby, Brian's journal resting on her knees, its brittle pages carefully marked with small slips of paper. "Mommy, is it okay if I draw Daddy again?" Emily asked, glancing up. Laura smiled softly, her heart aching at the tender question. "Of course, sweetheart. You can draw him as much as you want." Emily grinned and turned her attention back to her sketchpad. Her small hands worked quickly, her pencil strokes deliberate and sure. Laura returned her focus to the journal, her eyes scanning the final pages. Brian's words echoed in her mind, a mix of love, warning, and hope. "The pact's origins go deeper than we ever knew, but you can resist it by remembering. Love is stronger than any bond it tries to forge." The words comforted her, even as they hinted at the lingering threat. That night, after putting Emily to bed, Laura sat alone by the fire, the journal in her lap. The quiet of the house felt different now, not oppressive, but heavy with the weight of understanding. She thought about Brian's sacrifice, about the generations of pain and loss that had preceded them, and about the love that had ultimately broken the cycle. The faint hum of the pact was still there, like an echo barely perceptible at the edges of her awareness. But she no longer feared it. She had faced the darkness, and she had survived. As she closed the journal, a soft whisper brushed against her ears, so faint she almost missed it. "Thank you." Laura's breath hitched. She looked around, but the room was empty. Yet she felt it, a presence, warm and familiar, lingering in the space around her. "Brian," she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. The hum faded, leaving only the crackle of the fire and the quiet peace of the house. In the months that followed, Laura and Emily built a new life together. The house, once a place of pain and fear, became a sanctuary. The box from the cabin remained on the shelf, a reminder of the past they had endured and the love that had seen them through. Emily's art continued to flourish, her drawings filling the house with vibrant depictions of sunflowers, family scenes, and, always, Brian. One afternoon, as they walked through the forest, Emily stopped suddenly and turned to Laura. "Do you think Daddy's happy now?" she asked, her voice quiet. Laura knelt, pulling Emily into a hug. "I think he's proud of us," she said. "And I think he's at peace, knowing we're safe." Emily nodded, her small face serious. "I think so too." That night, as Laura tucked Emily into bed, she noticed a new drawing on the wall. It depicted the three of them, Laura, Emily, and Brian, standing in the field of sunflowers. Above them, the sky was filled with stars, their light soft and comforting. "Did you draw this today?" Laura asked, her voice trembling. Emily smiled. "I dreamed it," she said simply. Laura's throat tightened as she kissed Emily's forehead. "Good night, sweetheart." "Good night, Mommy," Emily murmured, already drifting off to sleep. As Laura lay in bed that night, she felt the familiar warmth settle over her, like an embrace that transcended the physical. She closed her eyes, a single thought filling her mind. They had survived, they had loved, and they would never forget. The echoes of the pact grew fainter with each passing day, their strength waning in the face of the Parker family's enduring love and resilience. And though the shadows of the past would always linger, Laura knew they would never again have the power to control their future. Brian's sacrifice had ensured that, and as Laura drifted into a peaceful sleep, the faintest of whispers echoed through the quiet house, soft, loving, and eternal. "I'm always with you,